Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's great to see you all here to the first BPC Climate and Trade Summit. It's a typical day in Washington. You know, there's the NATO Summit, there's the BPC Summit, there's a heat advisory. Welcome to the summer here. And I have to say, this is the main summit happening in town. We know that. Apologies to everyone trying to get around town for the NATO work. I know there's a lot of enthusiasm for that, but this is really where the most exciting conversation is going to be happening today. If you're in this room, you know who the BPC is, so I will be brief on that side of things. We're a federally focused policy research and advocacy organization working on a number of different energy and climate topics, from innovation to carbon capture to permitting reform. We have some farm bill work, we have some industrial decarbonization work going on. And we're very excited about this opportunity in climate and trade, which we'll be exploring more today. I should just say my name is Sasha, and I lead the energy program and have a whole host of my amazing team here with me, which you'll be seeing a lot of and hearing from throughout the course of the program today, which is really set up to be, I think, quite interesting. You know, the linkage between climate and trade is getting more and more attention, I think, as we all appreciate, in part because it's so bipartisan. It's an issue where we see Democrats and Republicans working together on legislation that gets support from industry and environmental groups. It's an issue where China hawks who care about national security, labor groups that care about US workers and employment, and climate hawks that care about emissions can all work together on a policy that can achieve multiple priorities simultaneously. And as you'll hear from many stakeholders throughout the program today, there's a lot of attraction to these frameworks from these different perspectives for entirely different reasons. And we think that makes it unique from a policy perspective, and it makes it really exciting from a policy opportunity perspective. And that's what we're at the BPC really trying to take advantage of and leverage as we walk through this issue in all of its dimensions, both today and on an ongoing basis. At the BPC, as you probably know, we've been leading the way on this issue, convening a monthly working group since 2021 that has really been helping to think through the details of how to effectively design a climate and trade policy that works in the service of the US strategic interests. We just published a report earlier this week that you'll hear more about today. We're seeing legislative activity from in the House, in the Senate, on a bipartisan basis. In fact, the Prove It Act was just introduced on a bipartisan basis yesterday. We're going to hear more about that today, of course. The president and his administration is actively working on these issues, and we're going to hear from his advisor in just a couple of minutes on what they're doing. And you know, it's our sense here at the BPC, this is just the beginning. We're at the beginning of, I think, a really important opportunity to shape this policy in a way that services all of these priorities that I just mentioned. And we're going to need to really lean on everybody in the stakeholder community, in this room and out there on the internet, that has expertise on these topics, because there's so much to be done and there's such a large opportunity here that we're really excited about. You'll hear more about some of the things that we're going to be doing going forward from just a couple of minutes. And I'm really excited to welcome you all here for this conversation. There's a jam-packed program, and I think you're going to enjoy it. So thank you for joining us. I also want to thank our sponsors. Of course, we do have some sponsors that help make this event possible. The Climate Leadership Council, Ceres, and the Steel Manufacturers Association. Thank you for your support. I also want to thank Senator Coons for helping us secure this lovely room. And last but not least, I want to thank the BPC team that helped pull this together. It's really been, as you can imagine, a lot of work that went into it. We have just such a great team across our program and our events team and the policy team. So thank you so much for all the work that went into this. And I am now going to transition over to the one and only Zan Fishman. If you know him, you'll know what I mean. He's really been leading this issue, driving this issue with technical expertise, political expertise, and he's going to serve as the MC for the rest of the afternoon. So with no further ado, let's welcome Zan. Thanks.
Hey, everybody. So I get to be the MC today, Master of Ceremonies. I don't know what kind of ceremony it's going to be. Baptism, bar mitzvah, bubbling brew, cauldron stuff. We'll see. But it's an issue where there are a lot of different, diverse stakeholders aligning on the same policy agenda, which is really exciting. So we're going to start today with some news. I'm announcing that BPC is launching a new advisory council on climate and trade, the members of which are Dave Banks, formerly with the National Security Council and now a fellow at BPC, Greg Bertelsen at the Climate Leadership Council, Maureen Hinman, Silverado Policy Accelerator, Kevin Dempsey with the American Iron and Steel Institute, Joseph Mikett at CSIS, Brad Markell, who used to be with AFL-CIO, Linda Dempsey with CF Industries, Dennis Shea, who's now at BPC, but formerly was Deputy USTR, and Jane Flagle, who's now at Stripe, but used to do industrial policy at the White House CEQ. So we're going to hear from a lot of those council members today, and we're going to be working with them in the coming months and years to help advance our agenda, figure out exactly where we should be focusing our analysis and our education and communication efforts. But now it's time for me to introduce our first speaker. And when we first started this work back in 2021, we started it as we typically do at BBC with a roundtable. Let's like host a workshop, get the smart people in the room who know about this stuff, and figure out if there's a there. And one of the people that I was most excited to get in the room was Ben Beachy. He's been thinking about this topic for longer than most of us. He's very smart, and now he's at the White House. And so I am thrilled to bring to the stage Special Assistant to the President, Ben Beachy, to tell us a little bit about his work at the White House on the Task Force on Climate and Trade. Please welcome Ben Beachy.
How's everyone doing? I'm from West Virginia. We do a little call and response thing. How's everyone doing? All right, good to see you. Well, thank you for having me here. Before diving into climate and trade, I'd like to speak just a little bit about the sea change that we're witnessing right now in our industrial sector and how trade fits as part of that industrial transformation. In the industrial sector, as in every other sector of the economy, the Biden administration is advancing a bold strategy to tackle climate change while creating good union jobs, while building a more equitable economy. We're taking on sources of emissions that others said were just too hard to tackle. And for all of you who have been working on industrial sector, you know that for too long, the industrial sector, a source of 1/3 of our climate pollution, has been dismissed as hard to abate. Well, we're burying that moniker. Hard to abate was yesterday. Today, we are changing the game by investing in emissions-cutting technologies that transform how we make steel, cement, aluminum, and other bedrock materials of our economy. And we're deploying these investments in a way that doesn't just create any old jobs, but it creates good, high-paying union jobs in manufacturing. Right now, this country is witnessing a manufacturing boom, driven in part by the president's climate law. And this administration is committed to making sure that workers, particularly hard-hit workers, reap the rewards of that boom. And it's critical that those rewards, those economic rewards, be accessible to hard-hit communities. The communities that have been hollowed out by deindustrialization. The coal communities that powered our nation for generations. Communities fighting for clean air. We are pairing these investments with tangible economic and health benefits in the communities that are on the front lines of building a more just economy. So climate, jobs, and justice. That trifecta is the engine of the Biden administration's climate strategy. Now, there are some naysayers to this approach. Some people who say we're trying to do too much. We're guilty of quote unquote an everything bagel strategy. I don't know if you've ever tried everything bagels. They taste pretty good. And the reason they taste pretty good is because they combine ingredients that go well together, like garlic, sesame seeds, onions, kind of like climate, jobs, and justice. These two go well together. We can only tackle the climate crisis by mobilizing trillions of dollars for climate action. Properly guided, that wave of investments can flow into good union jobs. Properly guided, it can flow into communities that have endured decades of divestment. Properly guided, our climate strategy is a jobs strategy, is an equity strategy. And that's not just a talking point, that's a policy priority. We are deploying all tools in the policy toolbox right now to spur that win-win-win in the industrial sector. That includes investments, procurement, and trade. Now on investments, we're putting our money where our mouth is. In March, the Department of Energy deployed the largest investment in US clean manufacturing in history. That's not hyperbole. DOE right now is deploying more than $6 billion to transform how we make the materials that are the backbone of our economy. Just take a look at cement. For literally millennia, we have made cement in a very emissions-intensive way. And right now, thanks to these investments, we're going to see the first projects emerging in the United States that will virtually eliminate emissions from cement, which is the world's most abundant building material. Or look at steel. After years of research into clean hydrogen, these investments will make the United States one of the first countries in the world to convert clean hydrogen into clean steel. Many of these projects are already signing commitments to unions to provide good, high-quality jobs. Many are located in disadvantaged communities, creating real opportunities for locally driven economic revitalization. This is exciting stuff. And we are pairing the supply-side push with an equally emphatic demand-side pull. The Biden administration's Buy Clean initiative leverages the sway of the US government as the largest purchaser on earth to catalyze demand for clean construction materials. Right now, agencies are deploying $4 billion to support clean US manufacturing when they buy steel and glass for federal buildings, asphalt and cement for federal highways. So how does trade fit into this mix? Well, as we are wielding the supply and demand tools to spur industrial transformation, we cannot allow unfair trade to undercut this transformation. And that brings us to the problem that we're all here to address today. To date, our trade policies have largely ignored climate change. This climate loophole in our trade policies has incentivized a shift in energy-intensive manufacturing to countries with weaker standards, lower wages, and higher pollution. This global race to the bottom has undercut our workers, our industrial communities, and our climate goals alike. I mean, just take a look at aluminum. The United States used to be the world's largest producer of aluminum. And many of our aluminum smelters were powered by clean hydropower. But since the 1990s, smelter after smelter closed its doors under divestment, under unfair trade. And each closure meant lost jobs for workers, lost tax revenue for industrial communities. And while US production declined, production in China rose to take its place. Today, China produces more than half of the world's aluminum. That's not just an industrial competitiveness problem. That is a climate problem, because the average ton of aluminum produced in China causes 65% more carbon emissions than in the United States. Overall, we have seen in recent decades US industrial emissions decline while global industrial emissions have risen. Right now, industrial emissions globally are the #1 source of climate pollution by end use. This race to the bottom is not compatible with good jobs, not compatible with the revitalization of hard-hit communities, not compatible with a livable climate. That's why we're ending it. The era of climate-agnostic trade policies is over. The era of companies dumping their pollution overseas is over. The era of countries using lax standards to undercut our workers in clean manufacturing is over. In its place, we are working with all of you to help spur a race to the top. We are collaborating with allies across the aisle and across oceans to help build a new, coordinated trade framework that actually rewards clean manufacturing. That is why we launched the White House Climate, Trade, and Industrial Competitiveness Task Force, to close the climate loophole in our trade policies. If we get the details right, and there are a lot of details, we have the opportunity to spur deeper cuts in industrial emissions across borders while supporting good jobs, while supporting industrial competitiveness. And thankfully, we don't have to start from scratch, because members of Congress, many of whom you're going to hear from today, have been devising smart climate and trade policies to support these very goals. Senator Coons and Senator Kramer have led the charge with the Prove It Act. Senator Whitehouse with the Clean Competition Act. Senator Cassidy with the Foreign Pollution Fee. Members of Congress across the political spectrum have been sponsoring these and other bills to merge climate and trade policies. And we applaud, the White House applauds this bipartisan initiative to merge climate and trade policies, to level the playing field, to support good jobs and climate action in the same breath. And we look forward to working with members of Congress, as well as industry, labor, environmental, academic, and other experts to make sure that we get the policies right. We also are looking forward to continued dialogue with trade partners who are designing their own versions of climate and trade policies, as well as allies across the developing spectrum, to make sure that we are developing a coordinated, interoperable approach to climate and trade, not a patchwork of disparate approaches. As we go forward, data is actually one of the core things that we have to get right in this coordination. Sturdy, solid emissions intensity data is the firm foundation that we need for sturdy climate and trade policies. The sponsors of the Prove It Act rightly recognized this and offered a thoughtful solution. To help lay the groundwork, the task force can work with all of you, our trade partners, and other experts to help build a rigorous methodology for accurately reporting embodied emissions. And of course, data is not the only tricky thing in the wonky list of details that we have to get right. We look forward to working with you to get all of those details right as we build a climate and trade policy toolkit that is as fair as it is ambitious. That brings me to the last thing that the task force is working on, which is to cohere any new climate and trade policies with the policies I mentioned before that are part of the toolbox for spurring clean manufacturing. The investments in President Biden's historic climate law, buy clean procurement practices, and other policies that we can pursue to simultaneously reduce industrial emissions and boost industrial competitiveness. By marrying climate and trade policies with this holistic mix to support clean manufacturing, we can win the industrial transformation that we need to secure a livable climate and an equitable economy. We can together launch the race to the top that our workers and communities deserve. It is ambitious, it will not be easy, but working together, we can do hard things. Just look at the sea change that is happening right now in climate and trade, thanks in large part due to the people in this room. So I thank you for your leadership. We look forward to partnering. Let's get this done.
Next up, we're going to take it back to the foundation. Anybody in this room who's been focused on climate and trade has probably heard of the term carbon advantage. And the organization that really coined this term and did the seminal analysis on the carbon advantage, the Climate Leadership Council. So I'm about to bring to the stage one of my absolute favorite communicators in general, and especially on this topic, Katrina Rourke, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council. Please welcome to the stage Katrina Rourke.
Hey y'all. Thank you, BPC, for having this conversation today. My water bottle's gonna slide right now. And thanks for including me. I'm really excited to be in a room with so many people focused on this issue. Those of us who have been at it for a while, we feel the strength in numbers. Excited for the party we're launching today. As Zan said, I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit working to identify and advance the most effective and fair climate solutions. I'm also the Executive Director of our Center for Climate and Trade, where we explore a whole lot of the issues that we're going to be unpacking throughout the day. In our work, we have the privilege of working with affected industry, international partners, climate leaders, environmental and labor organizations, academia, and we're really working hard to identify and pull forward the most important narratives and policy solutions that might help us solve a pretty tricky problem. And so let me tell you a story today in 3 parts. The first is, we're not going to address climate change at the scale and speed required unless we address the emissions associated with international trade. The second is that trade policies are uniquely capable of introducing a new system of accountability and lowering global emissions. And the third is that, happily, the policies that can lower global emissions are also going to confer benefits on American manufacturers. From our colleagues today, you're going to hear about more aspects of this story, geopolitical benefits, how this will impact China and Russia. But let's focus our conversation now on understanding the connection between climate policy and American competitiveness. This is what we know. This chart just shows global emissions by country from the most recent year for which we have data. China is now the largest emitter globally, roughly a third of global emissions in that red wedge. The US is just 14%. We're the dark blue. Add in that light blue wedge, that's all of our G7 partners, the EU, UK, Japan, Canada, and we creep up to 25%. If we're going to bend the curve on global emissions, we have to figure out how to reduce emissions outside of these wealthy climate-motivated markets. China comes to mind, India, but this pie chart is just a snapshot. Emissions growth through mid-century is going to come almost entirely from markets that represent a pretty small share of global emissions today. Southeast Asia, subsumed in that yellow wedge, Africa in that dark green wedge. These countries are rapidly growing and industrializing and building out the energy infrastructure necessary to meet their needs. Economic development, industrialization, education, healthcare, they're growing. And their emissions are growing at roughly 3% a year today. Addressing emissions from climate-ambitious G7 markets is not going to cut it. And likewise, we're not going to address climate change unless we address traded emissions. This is what we also know. Roughly 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally are associated with goods that are made in one country but consumed in another. And that makes trade a really powerful tool to address global emissions. A lot of the conversation that we've had to date to lower emissions, a lot of what you'll hear today, is framed around a series of policies that would charge imported products based on the carbon emissions associated with their manufacture. These policies have a whole lot of names. The European Union calls it a carbon border adjustment mechanism. You'll hear foreign pollution fee today, but they're all getting at the same thing, introducing a new system of accountability. And it's really important because where you make something matters. At the Council, we've studied the differences in carbon intensity of production across sectors and products for our trading partners around the world, and consistently we find dramatic differences in the carbon intensity of manufacturing. Some markets require 2, 3, 4 times the amount of emissions the US does to create the very same dollar of value. Here, I'm showing you a summary of the relative carbon intensity of production across all traded goods for some of our key partners, because I had to fit it on a slide, just barely, USMCA, EU, BRIC countries. Every red box is a sector in a country that requires more emissions than the United States. Every blue box, fewer emissions than the United States, white box, about the same. And those red boxes are what we call the US carbon advantage. When Ben says that global emissions, global production of really carbon-intensive goods like aluminum and steel are not just a competitive problem, but a climate problem, this is the data behind that. These numbers are hard to read, so let me summarize some takeaways for you. The global economy requires, on average, 80% more emissions than the United States to create the same dollar of value. China, India, Russia, 3 to 4 times the amount of emissions as the United States. Even the EU, which has operated an ambitious domestic emissions trading regime for 20 years, only edges us out by a bit, and even then, not in every sector. This chart is roughly organized with agricultural and industrial products toward the top, more complex manufactured products toward the bottom. And you'll notice that soup to nuts, the US maintains its carbon advantage through all phases of production. Whether we're making steel or chemicals or solar panels or cars, the US does it with fewer emissions than our competitors. Like emissions shares, this isn't a fixed picture either. As Ben was recounting, recent US policy is driving a whole lot of investment in industrial decarbonization, decarbonizing energy sources in the US, and that's going to continue widening this carbon advantage. Okay, let's look at these red boxes in 2 ways. The first is an environmental challenge. There's a lot of work to do to get global manufacturing powerhouses like China, like India, to reduce their emissions. Obviously, there are pathways by which they can manufacture these products with fewer emissions. It's a challenge to get them there. But the second way to look at those red boxes is a competitive opportunity. American firms have already invested in the research, innovation, and deployment of technologies and solutions that have earned them a carbon advantage in the US market. And so how do we turn a carbon advantage into a competitive advantage? It comes down to a simple question. If the US was able to claw back market share from a more carbon-intensive economy like China, would that be good or bad for emissions? Well, one way to measure that is that domestic emissions may go up, but global emissions are going to go down because US manufacturers will be displacing more carbon-intensive manufacturers abroad. This is the key to marrying climate and economic competitiveness goals. And we have a recent example to prove the case. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the European Union moved quickly to disentangle themselves from sources of Russian natural gas. They ended up importing a whole lot more US LNG. It kept the lights on. It helped the EU reduce dependence on an adversary, and it helped the EU shift their market from a methane-intensive source of natural gas to a less intensive source. Russian natural gas is plagued by poor infrastructure and large methane leaks. The National Energy Technology Laboratory has demonstrated that natural gas delivered into Europe from the Russian market has 3 times, wow, Katrina, the upstream emissions as natural gas from the United States also delivered in to the European market. Our natural gas is less emissions intensive. And so that was a choice rooted in geopolitics. But the questions that we're asking today about policy design, we're asking ourselves, what if the same phenomenon was to be triggered by climate policy? I should also add that the Prove It Act, introduced in the Senate by Senators Coons and Kramer, the House by Representatives John Curtis and Scott Peters, all of whom you'll hear from today, would task the national labs with developing a more sophisticated version of this data set with greater detail about the US carbon advantage. All right, and now I told you that I would tell you why this was good for American businesses. The best example of this, I think, is the steel sector. They're ahead of the curve on documenting emissions intensity. We've just got a lot of data to work with, and I like data. So this is a good test case. Here you'll see a chart. It's got the same color coding as the one before, but there are no blue boxes on this one because the US is the most carbon efficient manufacturer of steel in the world. I've segmented the market here into 2 parts. The top line is flats, think car doors. The bottom, longs, think rebar. And depending on the market segment, Chinese steel is 2 to 5 times more carbon intensive than US production. They're far and away the largest manufacturer globally, and they actively use their market size to make it harder for more efficient American competitors to compete in our market, in the global market, and to make the investments necessary to continue decarbonizing. But once we introduce accountability for emissions, those trends turn on their head. By charging steel products based on the carbon intensity of production, we would see US-made steel sales increase about 9%, profitability increase about 40%, and imports cut in half. These are real competitive benefits for an energy-intensive major manufacturing sector conferred by climate policy. And this is the paradigm shift. A lot of conversations about climate policy put in tension US climate goals and economic goals. But trade policies can uniquely unite those two ambitions. Good climate policy is good economic policy. And with that, I'll invite colleagues from industry to join me on the stage and unpack more about what the carbon advantage means for them. Thank you so much.
So you can see why I said she's such a good communicator. That's why I'm asking her to do double duty, moderating this next panel on industry, so we can hear from some of the industries themselves as to what these sorts of policies really mean on an industry by industry basis. You know, getting into the weeds, what does it mean for steel? What does it mean for cement? So I'm so excited to have on the stage Brandon Ferris, the Vice President of Government Affairs from the Steel Manufacturers Association, Sean O'Neill, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs from the Portland Cement Association, Michael Parr, the Executive Director of the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance, and Aram Zemgojian, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at ESS Incorporated. And over to you, Katrina.
Thanks, Ann. Okay, great. So we've heard a lot about the sort of overarching data, but I'm really looking forward to unpacking with y'all what investing in a carbon advantage and what climate and trade policy might mean for your industries. We've got two of the most sort of energy-intensive, carbon-intensive manufacturing segments globally. Each of you are representing about 8% of global emissions on the stage. Nice work. And then we've got the solution set, right? So we've got solar and batteries, and so this will let us look at how different market segments can all benefit from these approaches. So with that, Brandon, tell me more about steel.
A few minutes ago, you said where you make something matters, and it doesn't matter anywhere more than steel. So the US steel has a major carbon advantage. America produces steel while emitting less CO2 than all of our major competitors. I love data as well. So US steel producers are somewhere between 75 to 320% more carbon efficient than global producers. Increasingly, we see the rest of the world that's trying to copy our steel industry. You mentioned the EU, and they're very much trying to copy our steel industry. Why do we have this tremendous advantage? Over 70% of American steel is now produced in modern electric furnaces, the most efficient production process with substantially lower emissions. EAFs have an emission profile 70% lower than traditional steelmaking processes. The US also has a carbon advantage because we let market forces determine the production route. EAFs are inherently more efficient, so virtually every new mill built in the last 50 years in the US has been an electric furnace. Today, they account for all domestic production of long products and a majority of the flat products. In contrast, when you look at the rest of the world, only around 5% of steel production in China uses the most efficient process. Look at Brazil, and it's around 15%. Our members are continuing to invest in their global leading steel products. They will invest $18 billion over the next 3 years, leading the way in electrification, modernization, and decarbonization of America's steel industry. We have a tremendous advantage over the rest of the world. However, current climate and trade rules don't give American steel producers credit for their cleaner operations, which is one of the things I was very happy to support the Prove It Act. We saw Congressman Peters walk in a few minutes ago, and that really does exactly what it says. We are better than the rest of the world, prove it. And so if there were a policy that accounted for carbon emissions, US steel production would supply a greater share of our domestic market. For instance, steel exporters to the US emit 50 to 100% more CO2 per ton than US producers on average. That could lead to some of the most carbon-intensive markets, like China and Brazil, being further reduced in the US market, which could create even greater economic benefits for our domestic steel industry. We could see production increases across all major steel regions, such as the Great Lakes, the South, and the West. That would be coupled with all regions that would see additional economic growth. Steel supports all manufacturing. It supports all economic growth. So overall, the US economy is 3 times more carbon efficient than that of China, 4 times as efficient as India, and nowhere is our advantage more apparent than in our efficient, modern, domestic steel industry.
Thank you. Thanks, Brandon. All right, so we use a lot of steel, but we also use a whole lot of cement globally. Tell us more, Sean, about how these dynamics are playing out in the cement industry and what climate and trade policies might mean.
Great, thank you. And first of all, thanks to BPC for holding such an important and timely summit. It really is critical to have this conversation, and we at PCA are happy to be a part of it. As I do these things, often I like to ask a question: is who knows, by the show of hands, who knows the difference between cement and concrete out in the audience? All right, I can sort of see everybody. All right, so just to kind of a parochial view of things. So cement is to concrete like flour is to cake, right? So you need, in order to have concrete, which is the second most consumed material on Earth, you need cement production. And so we are critical not only to building the infrastructure that we all, I think, that's critically important to all of us, roads, bridges, but all of the buildings that we're in. So we are critical industry in the United States and throughout the world. So the demand for cement and concrete is only going to grow as populations grow. We recognize, our members recognize the important role that we play. You mentioned the emission numbers and what steel and cement play in that, and we take that very, very seriously. Our members, climate and sustainability for us is an utmost priority. Our members have been focused on it. They've been investing in technologies that lower their carbon footprint. And we've been advocating for policies that will help us in the cement industry achieve our goal, which is to be carbon neutral by 2050. So for us as an energy-intensive, trade-exposed industry, the intersection of climate policy and trade policy is critical for us to reach our goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. As an industry, we're focused on several things, but I want to just focus on three, and Brandon touched on some of these that we're already working on. I think first and foremost, the need for carbon reduction technology, CCUS, to invest more in that technology is critically important for our industry to lower our carbon intensity. The process of making cement, taking limestone and other raw materials and turning that into clinker, which eventually becomes cement, is known as the chemical fact of life. That emits CO2. So in order to address that chemical fact of life, we need scalable, affordable, carbon capture technology. And then there's the permitting angle to that too. Policies that will allow the permitting of these projects, whether it's to install the carbon capture technology or sequester the captured carbon or transport the captured carbon, is critically important. So we as an industry are investing in these technologies. We're also partnering with the Department of Energy. Two of our members received up to $500 million in grants from OSED in their industrial demonstration grant program. So our members will match that. So you'll see $1 billion of investment in 2 cement production facilities in the United States to advance carbon capture technology. So that again is critically important in our in the investment we're doing in reducing our carbon footprint. And then to touch on 2 other specific areas, one would be to increase the use of alternative fuels in the cement manufacturing process. So we traditionally rely on fossil fuels, coal and petcoke, to heat up that cement kiln to 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. And we can supplement that fuel using alternative fuels, biomass, plastics, railroad ties. You can really, anything that has an energy intensity, we can combust in the kiln and use that as fuel. And again, that helps lower our carbon footprint. When we talk about where our partners are on this, our trade partners, the EU is north of 50% alternative fuel use. whereas in the United States, we hover around 10 to 15%. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's some regulatory challenges there, permitting challenges as well, but that's another area where we're making some improvements. And then lastly, last point I want to touch on is growing the market for lower carbon cements and concretes. The Buy Clean program being, that was mentioned earlier, is important to us. We need a market that exists to expand the production of and the use of low carbon cements and concretes. Our members are investing in innovation. They're looking at market innovations. But again, I think there's a lot of folks that it's just not us that are going to be able to move this process forward to allow us to reach our goals. It's going to take many of us and a lot of folks that are represented by people in the room. So that's, I think I'll hand it back over to you, but those are really the three main drivers for us.
Terrific. Really encouraging to hear about all of the investments and creativity going into decarbonize these sectors. Next, I'm going to turn to Michael. I think I borrowed where something's made matters from you, so thank you for that. But I want you to talk to us more about the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance and what the manufacturers in that alliance are doing to highlight the benefits of making decarbonization technology with fewer emissions.
Happy to. By way of background, the Alliance is a global association of manufacturers across the solar supply chain, and our goal is to decarbonize solar manufacturing end to end. I'm pleased to say that solar manufacturing is a manufacturing success story in the US right now. Every single one of my members is expanding or investing for the first time in manufacturing in the US and many other companies as well. We currently have several 100,000 new solar jobs and roughly 1 million new US jobs tied to solar manufacturing just in the last several years. Why? Solar's fastest growing energy source globally. There's huge demand for it. And the IRA and other policies have been a real boon to drawing some of that investment to the US. Why are we trying to decarbonize solar? Seems a little counterintuitive. Isn't it a clean energy source? And yes, it is. It's a zero carbon generating source and currently one of the lowest cost sources of energy globally. But there is a little irony in the background. Most of the solar manufacturing growth in the last 15 years or so has been in China, and they have grown at a scale that is hard to wrap your head around. There are elements of the solar supply chain that are quite energy intensive. And because China's grid is still so carbon intensive, and because they have put manufacturing of the most energy intensive components in areas like Xinjiang province or Inner Mongolia, which are essentially 98% coal-based grids, very high carbon emissions. Work by Breakthrough Energy suggested by the end of this decade, the current rates of growth in solar manufacturing in China, it will outstrip global aluminum as a source of emissions, and we will emit an additional 30 billion tons of CO2 by the end of the decade in Chinese solar manufacturing. Not a great look for clean energy. So our goal is to change that trajectory and get the Chinese industry to look more like the US or European industry, which has much better energy efficiency. We draw from much lower carbon grids. We do a lot more work on energy management, so we're taking our power when the renewables content of the grids is maximized. So how are we trying to do that? Really simple, and you mentioned, we're trying to create a market demand for low carbon solar. We're educating the market that not all solar is created equal. It's all good, but it's not created equal. And you buy a solar panel from a US supply chain and it will have roughly half the embodied carbon levels as a solar panel from the Chinese supply chain. Now that Chinese supply chain solar panel was probably assembled in Southeast Asia. They are very adept at hopscotching around to find countries in which to do this final assembly that allows them to evade trade restrictions that are important to the US. They're about to pick up from Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Cambodia and go to Indonesia because we're about to tariff those countries again. But it doesn't reduce the carbon footprint because they're just taking the Chinese components and moving them around where they put them together. And so we have been working really hard to educate markets about these carbon benefits, and because people deploy solar for low carbon purposes, there's a lot of uptake on this idea. We have worked with an independent third-party eco-label developer to develop a very rigorous eco-label by which people demonstrate that they're low carbon. So you can't just say, hey, I'm great, I did my own LCA with my own conditions, and look, it looks really good. There's a standardized process, third-party verified by experts. So far, only 2 companies in the world have qualified for it. Both are US manufacturers, more are in the queue. We want the Chinese to get it. We want them to decarbonize to get this eco-label, to be clear. But in the meantime, we really like the manufacturing advantage it gives us. A 2x carbon advantage, and if you've been reading news lately, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, all really big carbon pledges. Microsoft, a let's go negative carbon pledge. Also, building data centers as fast as they can, and in fact, all of their emissions are going up. They do a really good job of trying to source renewable energy to drive these data centers, but if they're using ultra-low carbon solar, bang, a 50% reduction in scope 3 emissions right there. So you can see the appeal of it. And so our goal is to use market forces to drive decarbonization. Policy helps, IRA's done a good job, and something like the Prove It Act to further demonstrate to people that these 2 solar panels will make the same energy, but this one used twice the amount of carbon to make as this one. Pretty easy choice, right? And in the short term, that means more solar manufacturing in low carbon economies like the US. In the long term, ideally, it means the entire global solar industry cleans up its act and we become a really, truly clean source of power.
Beautiful, well said. All right, Ram, next to you. As variable sources of power increase penetration on the grid, we electrify everything, including transportation. We're going to need a whole lot of batteries, and where batteries are made will matter. Can you tell us more about the carbon advantage in battery manufacturing and how climate and trade policies can benefit your industry?
Sure. I mean, we've talked a lot about how where something made is important. Also, how it's made and what it's made with. We occupy a pretty interesting space in the energy transition and the battery energy storage ecosystem. We are a non-lithium battery. We're actually an American manufactured aqueous iron flow battery. So what does that mean? Our raw materials, particularly for our electrolyte, are essentially food-grade iron, salt, and water, easily sourced, environmentally benign, nature-based. The balance of our systems is broadly sourced across 70-plus vendors across 29 states, right here at home. So how we're making is much lower in terms of carbon intensity than the predominant battery energy storage technology today, which is lithium ion, whether it be for EVs or the grid. We're not subject to the same questionable supply chains, and certainly not the same very carbon intensive manufacturing practices. We like to say that our manufacturing process is more akin to a Maytag dishwasher manufacturing plant. Very simple, very clean. In fact, UC Irvine undertook a study a couple of years back on various flow battery chemistries, vanadium, iron flow, and a couple others, and determined that in terms of impact on climate from cradle to gate and GHG impacts in particular, ESS ranked the highest in terms of its iron flow battery and was the most recyclable stationary storage battery in that category as well. So we too welcome progress on the Prove It Act, and we would certainly welcome the side-by-side comparison of our technology compared to more carbon-intensive manufactured batteries, particularly in China. To your point, policy does help. One thing we haven't really talked about is how policies can help American manufacturers export these solutions. We're a huge fan of the U.S. Export-Import Bank of the United States, and in particular, their Make More in America program and their China and Transformational Exports programs. And these programs, when EXIM, not if, but when EXIM is reauthorized in the next year or so, coupled with hopefully the Prove It Act being signed into law, will continue to open opportunities, not only domestically for American manufacturers to deploy the clean tech that our grid needs to decarbonize, but also open opportunities for American clean tech manufacturers to export these solutions, particularly in markets where China is dumping much more carbon intensive and less clean solutions.
Beautiful. I'm really glad we got in export more on this panel. The flip side of climate and trade policies, not just about accountability for what comes in, but getting more good stuff out. Brilliant. Thank you for sharing your perspectives from industry, helping us cover the map here. And thank you for tuning in and participating in this conversation.
All right. Now we are going to go back in the Wayback Machine, back in time, to take a look at what the Trump administration's view was on linking trade policy with environment policy. We've got two members of our newly announced BPC Climate and Trade Advisory Council. First up, we've got Dennis Shea, who is former Deputy USTR and the US Ambassador to the WTO. And will be moderated by Dave Banks, who's a fellow at BPC and was former Special Assistant for International Energy and Environment at the National Economic and National Security Councils from 2017 to 2018. So welcome to the stage, Dennis and Dave.
Hey, everyone.
Hi.
Takes me long to get over because I'm a slow walker. I'm a Southerner. Excuse me. Oh, well, thank you, Dennis.
Good place?
No, it's good. You know,
Okay.
I like you enough. You know, you
10
don't have to be
minutes,
too
this is
far.
like speed dating here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining.
Sure.
Really appreciate it. I know the audience is really interested in your views on and your experience with the Trump administration and how you guys viewed environment and trade. But then also, you know, the big question out there is, you know, how would a Trump 2.0 potentially view this policy space and what sort of work could they advance? And so I think with that, we've got less than 10 minutes now.
Okay. All right.
So why don't we just jump in the conversation?
Sure. Well, if you want to talk about trade and the environment during the Trump administration, you have to start with the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is the revision to the NAFTA agreement. And USMCA has the strongest, most comprehensive set of environmental standards of any trade agreement entered into by the United States. These standards are in the core text of the agreement. They're also enforceable, subject to a dispute resolution. And as a general matter, they require the three parties not to weaken their environmental laws to promote or encourage trade and investment. And there are other elements of the USMCA that relate to air quality and marine life and trafficking in wildlife and illegal fishing. So that is probably the cornerstone of the environmental success that USTR achieved during the Trump administration. We did other things like, hey, there's an agreement called the US-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement, and there's an exporter in Peru who's illegally harvesting timber and importing it into the United States. So Ambassador Lighthizer, my boss at USTR, blocked that 3 times, blocked the imports of illegally harvested timber into the United States 3 times using the authority, the enforcement authority granted under the US-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement. My perch was in Geneva, Switzerland at the World Trade Organization. And one of the things I spent a lot of time on was advancing a comprehensive multilateral agreement to curb fishing subsidies. It was part of the UN sustainability goals for the WTO to do this. So we advanced 5 separate proposals at the WTO. Probably we were part of the ambitious group along with countries like Australia and New Zealand to curb illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, subsidies for that, to curb subsidies for overfishing and overcapacity, to curb subsidies for distant water fishing. You see the huge Chinese trawlers out around the Galapagos, you know, sucking up all the marine life there, to promote notifications of subsidies and to prevent carve-outs, exemptions from the rules for so-called developing countries that were actually very heavily involved in fishing. So
We were advancing that in a very comprehensive way, a very ambitious way. The WTO, a couple of years ago, its ministerial enacted the low-hanging fruit. You know, they enacted an agreement to prohibit subsidies for IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. But the more ambitious part of the effort has yet to be completed. At the end of my term, at the WTO, we circulated at Ambassador Lighthizer direction, circulated a draft general counsel decision that basically said that to clarify the understanding under something called the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, that's a WTO agreement. We circulated a document to the general counsel, which is the governing body of the WTO, saying that if a country fails to adopt, maintain, and implement environmental regulations at or above a fundamental threshold of standards, that is potentially an actionable subsidy under the countervailing, under the subsidies, agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. And a company or hurt by that can actually seek a countervailing duty to offset that. So those are sort of four things, Dave, that stand out to me. I'm sure there are more, but those are the four things that came to mind.
Well, and let's step back just a little bit too, because you know, for folks who aren't that familiar with sort of the trade policy, I mean, one of the focuses of the Trump administration's trade policy was to hold countries accountable for unfair trade practices.
Right.
And when we're talking about unfair trade practices, that can include and should include countries that use either lax standards or enforcement and compliance, because sometimes they'll have the standards on the books, but they won't enforce, right? But using that record to essentially create a competitive advantage in trade, and that's what, so the policies that you guys pursue has just kind of flowed from that principle.
That's actually true. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about Bob Lighthizer. I mean, he was the most consequential USTR in the nation's history, in my judgment. And he basically said economic security is national security. I come from the Republican perspective, and for a long time, I know you do too, I think for a long time, those two things were held separately.
Right.
You know, national security is military, planes, guns, boats, bullets, and economic security is something else. But particularly in the competition today with China, there's just a great awareness now that economic security is national security, and Bob Lighthizer was very instrumental in pushing that.
And by the way, a visionary. In a sense, right? Because, I mean, he's been making these arguments about environment and trade and industry subsidies for at least for the past 30 years.
Absolutely. You know, he was a lawyer in private practice, did a lot of work for the steel industry. But he also, another paradigm shift is that we're not just, that Bob kind of pushed very, very aggressively. We're not just consumers in this country. We have to think of ourselves not just as consumers, but also as producers. Okay, a country does not become strong and powerful by buying high-definition televisions and just consuming. A country becomes strong and powerful by inventing, by producing, by manufacturing. So that was, I think, a paradigm shift that Bob helped advance. And he also advanced the point that, you know, our market, we're the largest economy in the world, the largest import market in the world. And you know what? We have leverage. We have leverage. Being the largest gives us a lot of leverage. And to your point, Dave, about, you know, we have all decided, you know, we're in Congress. Congress decides that we're going to accept some minimum level of health standards. We're going to accept labor standards. We're going to accept environmental standards. These values are more important than pure efficiency.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So if we're going to abide by those standards, then those entities who are seeking to import into the US market should also abide by them. And if they're not, then they should be charged, perhaps.
Okay, so the big question that people have, of course, is what would a Trump 2.0 possibly do if President Trump's reelected? And of course, Mr. Lighthizer, the ambassador, has been on the record supporting a carbon border adjustment mechanism without a domestic price on carbon. Of course, I think that's an important nuance there. But he has certainly talked about, and you brought his book.
I brought the book, yeah.
And are you getting $1 per book?
No fee. I'm not getting
Okay.
no cut out of this.
Just
no
want to be
fee,
transparent,
no
just
fee.
in case.
Right. No, he put together, I really recommend this, No Trade is Free. And then he has a chapter at the end about the path forward. And that's a very useful chapter to understand at least where he's coming from. I know you mentioned a carbon border adjustment fee, and I'll just read what he writes in here. Many members of Congress would have to take my glasses off to read, I'm getting that old, would like us to have a carbon border adjustment fee put on imports. I agree. If a product is produced in another country by using much more carbon than we would tolerate here, why should that import have a price advantage in our market over a US product that is made producing much less carbon? Such a fee would help clean the global environment and create jobs in America.
Now, he's obviously very close to the campaign, and he's clearly the architect of Trump's trade policy today in the campaign. And so the big question that people would like to know, in a Trump 2.0 scenario, do you think there's a possibility that the administration could pursue ideas on how to hold foreign polluters accountable, which could include a tariff or fee on foreign polluters in order to level the playing field for U.S. industry?
Well, I'm not, I cannot speak for the campaign, but
None of us can.
right. But I think that's something that's definitely on the table. I mean, you look at the platform talks about reciprocity in tariffs, talks about building up American manufacturing. So, and Bob's point of view is pretty clear, and he's obviously extremely influential in Trump circles.
Thanks, Dennis.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Thank all of y'all.
One final segment before we go to intermission. This is the showstopper. This is the curtain closer. We are going to have a wonderful fireside chat. Then we're going to have a short coffee break, and then we'll come back for the second segment. We have just a treat for you guys. These two members of Congress, Congressman Scott Peters from California and John Curtis from Utah, Democrat and Republican, both are just advocates, champions, serious bipartisan legislators. Yesterday, they introduced the House version of the Prove It Act. We're really excited about it, but I don't want to steal their thunder, so I'm turning it over to the two congressmen and my colleague from the Bipartisan Policy Center, Leslie Dunn-Tarasimi.
Hello, everyone. Seems like every single previous speaker has mentioned the Prove It Act, so now we have the opportunity to hear directly about it. We're really excited. If anyone doesn't know, Prove It Act stands for Providing Reliable, Objective, Verifiable Emissions Intensity and Transparency Act. Prove It Act. So, Congressman Curtis, what does the Prove It Act do? Can you just tell us a little bit about it? Why do you think these types of data are necessary?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I could call it by its real name. I know it by the Prove It Act, so that was actually pretty impressive. And second of all, before I even start, this is where Scott knows I'm going to give Scott just a big shout out, Congressman Peters. There's really nobody, in my opinion, more genuine in Congress on either side of the aisle than Congressman Peters, and it's just an honor to work with you and be on this bill with you. So the Prove It Act, and Scott and I love to kind of enjoy this moment, like, okay, guys, it's a study, right? The amount of attention it has received, you would think that we were doing a major piece of legislation, but it's a study, and at the heart, it proves, in my opinion, that the United States is a leader in the way that we manufacture, the way that we produce, and what we do. And that information has been out there, but never really an official source, provided by an official source. And so this makes it an official source and proves how good we are, and at the same time may highlight some areas where we could do better. And I also think it's important to acknowledge those and start working on those as well.
Yeah, so anything you missed, what would you add?
I just want to say, again, I have to thank John for being a great partner. John did something really profound. You may not have noticed, when I came into Congress in 2012, there were a lot of Republicans who were just denialists about climate change, and John started the Conservative Climate Caucus. He's now got over 80 members.
87?
87 members who say that climate change is happening and that it's driven by human events, and that's really an important place setting for us to work from. And I thank you, John, for doing that. I also give John a hard time about, well, now we got to do something about it. Here we are, working on a bill together, so that's really rewarding and I think productive.
Yeah, and it's not just you two, right? There's a lot of interest from both Republicans and Democrats. You had a lot of co-sponsors on this bill. So what do you think is bringing folks, along when you think about getting others on board with the bill?
I believe that they too want to know this information, right? I think that there's a sense of like, why wouldn't we want to know this information? What are we hiding? It feels like almost like that you're hiding something. And I'll make a point for Scott that he'll probably make, which is that if we want to claim that we're the best in the world, that needs to be real data, right? And I think me and a lot of my colleagues, particularly Republicans, like to claim that we're the best at this. So let's get the real data and prove it.
Right. I think that's why the Chamber of Commerce is supportive. We want, first of all, businesses are going to want to be able to sell clean stuff. And I think also when we get to the negotiating table in trade, we want to have the information to push back on the kinds of things we hear out of Europe, which is that they're going to impose tariffs effectively on folks without a carbon tax. We're not going to have a carbon tax. We could talk about that. I favor that. I thought it would have been a better approach, but that's not where we're going. In the absence of that, a metric that's X dollars a ton, we need to have information sector by sector about how we're doing in comparison to other countries, so that when we do come to negotiate trade, we have the real ammunition and the truth, and we want to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add on that
Absolutely.
a little bit? I think if you look closely, a lot of what's happening in the market is driven by clean. And I tell a lot of my Republican colleagues, right, like if you don't care about the environment, you at least care about the market, right? And that you should be paying attention to this. And the world wants to buy clean. And so therefore, let's show and demonstrate that we are clean.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to add a little bit to that, so you mentioned that, Congressman Curtis, you founded the Conservative Climate Caucus in the House to work on conservative solutions to climate change. And so how does this bill kind of fit with that, and why is this issue generally something that conservatives should be focusing on?
So I spend a lot of time convincing conservatives they should care, right, about this. It's actually not that hard. And one of the things I like to appeal to is, do you want to leave the earth better than you found it? To this day, I've never found anybody who says no, right? And that I think it's important to start with those commonalities, right? Places where we share, and we don't have to have a big debate. And so if you want to leave the earth better than you found it, now we can have a really thoughtful debate about how best to do that. And I think for too long, Republicans have stayed on the sideline in this discussion, not brought our ideas forward, and then just complained about the Democrats' ideas, right? We've become really good at saying what we don't like. Well, this gives us, for the first time, an opportunity to step up to the plate and say, no, this is what we like, and let's have a debate about whose ideas reduces the most emissions. The second thing I like to say is, do you want to leave the earth better than you found it? And then can we all agree less pollution is better than more pollution? Mm-hmm. We haven't had to talk science and we get on the same page, right? And everybody agrees with that. And so now what are the Republican ideas? What are the conservative ideas that we would put out on the table that maybe haven't been there before or have been there but need support? And for instance, I'd point to nuclear as a really good example, right? Where Republicans have long wanted more of a discussion about nuclear. And so being at the table gives us a chance to put some of those things at the table. So that was kind of a long answer about like why Republicans should care about Prove It and why they should care about this whole dialogue. And I think it's just been a huge mistake to the extent that we've not been part of that conversation. I don't even think it's been good for our Democratic colleagues either not to have us, they're a part of that discussion.
Yeah, definitely. And so speaking on caucuses, coalitions, Congressman Peters, you're an active member of the New Dems, the New Democrat Coalition, committed to working across the aisle to build an economy that works for every American. And so as we think about climate trade policy, is this an opportunity to support those New Dem goals for economic growth? How do you see that playing out?
Sure, we're very concerned about climate change. We're also concerned about American competitiveness. I just think we don't want to be caught flat-footed against other countries as we talk about American achievement. One of the things that's really exciting about climate action is that so much innovation is happening in our private sector. And I'll say, when I came to energy and commerce, a lot of the conversation I heard from Republicans was, why are we worried so much about doing this to America if we only account for 10% of emissions? Well, one reason is you want to show the rest of the world that we can have a high standard of living without just depending on dirty fuel. But the other thing you want to do is provide our businesses the chance to develop the technologies and strategies to deal with these issues around the world, so we can sell that abroad. And I think we're excited about that as New Democrats. And the Prove It Act, again, the data can only help us. And by the way, we'll sort out maybe if some of our folks are dirty, we'll know that too, where we have to make improvements and compete. But the whole idea of the IRA was to provide subsidies and financial support for better outcomes in the private sector, and that's still a work in progress, but it's very consistent with what we're talking about in the Prove It Act today.
Yeah, definitely. So I was remiss. I should have mentioned at the top. So this is the first panel, not only with members of Congress, folks who have just introduced bills. We also have the opportunity in this panel to hear from you, members of the audience, to submit questions. You can do it online in the chat feature in YouTube, or if you're in the audience today, we actually have a handy-dandy QR code that we're going to put up on the screen, hopefully. And you can take out your phones. We typically don't like it when you take out your phones during a panel, but in this case, take them out, scan this, and then you can type in your questions. So this is how we're going to do it, high-tech ways.
May we submit?
You can definitely submit a question to each other.
I'm asking John why he wants to ban meat.
Yeah, definitely. So speaking of that, actually, not really speaking of that, but opponents of the Prove It Act, Congressman Curtis, I've been hearing some of these sort of strange arguments, right? That Prove It Act's going to lead to a carbon tariff, which is going to lead to the WTO, enforcing some kind of carbon tax in the United States. So what is that argument? Like, what's happening here, and why are people getting so spun up about this?
I view that as a really positive thing. If they're getting spun up, that means that we've got something, right? I mean, it tells you that something's here, something important is here. I do think it's disingenuous. Think for a minute that the claim that this is going to lead to a carbon tax. Let me come back to what we're doing. We're doing a study on data that's already there to have a government source, right? Yep. How is that going to lead? Please tell me, anybody make a rational conversation, debate about how that's going to lead to a carbon tax. I do think, so the reality of it is the climate world is full of red herrings, it's full of excuses, right? And I think this is one of the reasons it's been hard for Republicans and Democrats to come together. And I think, one of the things that Scott and I enjoy is we can take all those, we can push them aside and just deal with what's right in front of us. So I'm not surprised by the attacks, and I'm actually encouraged because it does tell me, hey, we've got something important here. And it does mean that we have to do a little bit of explaining, which is unfortunate. You would think people would see this at its face value. And then I would also point out, too, there have been a lot of attempts over the years for a carbon tax. Some of my closest friends in Utah are proponents of a carbon tax. Scott's a proponent of a carbon tax. It has been, all of those attempts have been unsuccessful. So how is it that all of a sudden this is the secret, right, to a carbon tax?
Can I just add to that too? I'm for a carbon tax. John's not. I thought it would have been even a better way to approach the challenge than the IRA, which has a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of cranks you got to turn, a lot of grants you got to fill out. But it wasn't there, and it was pretty clear that the Biden administration didn't support it, and folks in Louisiana didn't like it. The reason we have to do this is because there is no carbon tax, and we're not going to have one. We can't just say we got $100 a ton compared to your 110. We have to come up with this information in the absence of that easy metric. So if we had a carbon tax, we wouldn't need the Prove It Act. We would be able just to look at the number. But the fact is we don't have that. That's the reason we're doing this. So it's not going to lead to a carbon tax. It makes up for the fact that we're not going to have that information from a carbon tax readily available.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other things you sometimes hear is that, this climate trade policy their mind immediately goes to tariffs, right? And then that's an anti-free trade kind of an argument. So Congressman Peters, you are someone who is pro-free trade. You have supported free trade agreements with Asian Pacific nations in the past. So what's your reaction to this kind of an argument? And so are we seeing, there's opportunity here for peaceful coexistence of climate and trade and free trade?
First of all, I'd like to tell the Trump representative, we can rename it the Trump-Pacific Partnership, and they'll all get behind it, right? Yeah, I mean, I think this will facilitate free trade. It's likely to abate efforts to come after us as a country and our industries. I think we should be ready, and in a multinational economy where this is happening all over the world, there's a lot of competition. We don't want to be flat-footed, back on our heels. We have to be ahead of the game. So we should have passed this law a couple of years ago and gotten started. But the second best time to plant a tree is today, and we should do it. I think without it, we're really going to be, we're playing defense, and I think this is not good for American businesses and workers.
Definitely.
Yeah, I like to talk a lot about not just carbon, but a lot of regulations that we put on U.S. businesses that are not matched by people importing into the United States. So think for a minute about, let's pick on China. So think about human rights issues, think about OSHA and carbon emissions, and think of all the regulations that are placed on a U.S. business. Why is it okay to put those regulations on a U.S. business but then allow somebody to import into our country without those regulations? So they're either important regulations or they're not. So if we're not insisting on them product coming into the United States, well then let's stop putting those regulations on US businesses. Now, that would cause, quite a dither, but to me it's the same thing. It's like, well, how is that okay? And so I think this is an important conversation, and it was really important to me to listen to that previous little conversation because I'm very curious about where this is going, and if there's a Trump administration, where this is going. And I would like a really strong dialogue about every regulation we put on a US business that we don't require on somebody else that gets to import into our country. And why is that okay?
Yeah, that's an important point. I don't think we've touched on that yet. So there are human rights and labor standards provisions of the bill, is that right? Do you want to expand on what those are?
I do, and I think this is an important difference between the Senate version, and I think part of this was me saying, hey, look, this is bigger than just carbon, right? These are differences in how we regulate here versus other places. So let's do the study on those as well. Let's have that information. And I mean, it's remarkable to me that U.S. business competes and wins almost every time in these arenas with this tremendous handicap. But let's at least acknowledge the handicap, and if nothing else, inform consumers of the handicap. Let them make a more informed decision when they're purchasing something, and then have that conversation about, well, should we be doing more to level that playing field?
Definitely. And a theme that I heard come up earlier today in the conversations that we've been having is kind of this question of accountability and who are we holding accountable, and how does this bill necessarily help advance some of those priorities that we want to have.
You can't hold people accountable if you don't have the information. We just sort of we need a study. And I was here for a little while, but all the panels have mentioned the need for this information. Some have even referenced the act. It's referred to Ways and Means in the House. It is through the Senate committee, and we all ought to be working hard to see if we can't get it passed. Like I said, it's got bipartisan support. I think the chamber's for it. API's for the Senate version. I think they'll be for our version. I was talking to a representative from Chevron today. They think it's a good idea, and I think there are some outliers, but we got really widespread support. It makes sense, and I hope you all help us as you wander the halls. Let people know that we should get this over the finish line. This should not be that hard, right?
It's a study.
Yeah, so Congressman Curtis, what else would you say about the pathway for this bill moving it forward?
Well, I think we all have watched legislation in Washington, D.C., and you've all seen really good bills languish and die. You've all seen bills with lots of co-sponsors languish and die. And I think this is where there's a big burden on the two of us to chart a course, to lay a path, to give this bill the highest likelihood of moving forward. And there's a number of ways to do that. Favorable vote coming out of committee is a big deal. Co-sponsors, that's a big deal. Industry weighing in, that's a big deal. And if we do our job well, you all have seen this in Washington, moments come along that you can take advantage of, and you usually can't define that moment until you see it. It's usually different than what you think it is.
But you have to be ready for it.
And if you're ready for it, your bill is then ready to take advantage of that. And I think if you look back over the last few months on how both of our staffs, by the way, let's give our shout out to our staffs, have worked on this bill, you'll see just tons of work to get this bill ready. Some of that's co-sponsors. A lot of that was seeing what happened in the Senate. How can we improve the bill over on the House side? What criticism was there? How can we adopt to that criticism? So I think the path forward, in many ways, it relies on our ability to work this and get it ready, and then look for that window of opportunity when we can actually get it into law.
So I see some questions now rolling in from the audience. Definitely want to encourage more. If you have them, please do submit through the QR code and through the chat feature in YouTube. But maybe taking a step back. So we've talked a lot about the bill, what it does, what its future is, why it's needed. But what is the bigger picture for both of you in terms of how this type of climate trade focus and the need for data is really important to a broader set of climate priorities? And so Congressman Peters, you work on a lot, permitting reform, methane, wildfire prevention. So how does the climate trade angle kind of fit into that bigger picture of what you're trying to do?
There's a whole set of list of environmental issues you have to handle to deal with climate and with energy security, by the way, at a time when, for the first time, we're going to have a spike in demand for electricity. We're going to have to stop battling each other over where the transmission is good or pipelines are good. We're going to need to build a lot of stuff and get on the same page if we want the air conditioners to stay on. But one of the things we need to do is give attention internationally to climate. We are only responsible directly for 10, 12% of worldwide emissions, but we have a lot of influence over what happens in the rest of the world. I'd love to really start to think about foreign policy and how that affects other countries as they develop prosperity. What are they going to use for energy? And I think the United States has a real interest in our business community being involved in that decision. Nuclear is something we talked about. We had a lot of progress in the committee, almost unanimity about the need to move forward with that. But it's one atmosphere, and so I'm proud of what we're doing here. I think we're setting an example. We're creating a lot of innovation, but we need to deploy it around the world. Some of that will be direct investment, but a lot of that will be trade. And I think this is just one component of thinking about foreign policy through a climate lens, and I think we don't do enough of that.
Yeah, so I want to, this is us, I kind of want to give a contrast to that. So Scott's thinking internationally, and my mind actually went to back home in my district.
That's why you're in the Senate. You're not in the Senate.
So yeah, blah, 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 blah.
I'm for the Democrat, by the way.
I love to point out, that helps me. I love to point out that I represent a county, it's called Carbon County. And then I smile and say, what do you suppose, that they do in Carbon County? And I represent oil and gas. And I think as important is our look outward is our look inward, where we're failing, in my opinion. And we talk about transition, and all people hear is, you want to take away my livelihood, you want to take away my jobs, we're just not doing it well. And I think an important part of this conversation is how do we do this right in coal-producing counties? How do we do this right in oil and gas-producing counties? And one of the ways for me to do that is to totally change the dialogue and people never quite know what to do with me when I say this, but I've never seen any science that says that fossil fuels cause climate change. It's carbon. right? Not the fossil fuels, it's the carbon that does. So let's have a conversation about direct air capture, carbon sequestration, right? And let these people compete for clean, affordable, reliable energy. That's all they want, is to be able to compete. And these people, and then this is where the Prove It Act comes in, is like, they too often question the data or what's been given to them. So let's give them good data, right? And let's make them part of the solution, not the problem. And when I go into these counties and I talk about, guess what, folks, you can actually be part of the solution, not the problem. They love that. They're game for that challenge. But when you come in and say, you guys are bad, what you do is bad, right, we lose them. And of course, they're going to fight us on it.
Definitely. So we do want to congratulate you. You referenced your election win there. So excited, hopefully, in the fall.
Did we talk about the margin, or is that okay?
We certainly can if you want. But where are you seeing the kind of future in the, if you're moving to the Senate, are we thinking about how to engage the Republicans caucus on climate issues, on this potentially this?
Yeah, I'm asked that a lot because of my work in the House, and I usually refer to the fact that when I came to the House, I had no idea that I was actually going to be involved in this, let alone how I would be involved in it. And I feel a little bit that way going to the Senate. I can't walk into the Senate on day one and say, hey, I got this figured out, follow me, right? And so I want to fold into the efforts that are already there. They have a Climate Solutions Caucus that's very effective. And so I'll be watching carefully to see how I can help the efforts that are there and also add my own voice.
Definitely. Okay, so question from the audience. How can the U.S. leverage the carbon advantage without inflaming trade relations? You have thoughts on that one?
I mean, we see it coming already. We're going to have a little bit of a spat with Europe. And it doesn't have to be mean, but it has, we have to be armed. Like any business negotiation, it doesn't have to be inflamed. I think if we think we're going to prevail without information to defend ourselves, we're fooling ourselves.
Well, why is it a spat with Europe?
Well, Europe's already suggested that we're looking at tariffs on countries that don't invest, don't have carbon taxes, essentially. And so, we don't. We're going to have to come up with a fair understanding of how this should be adjusted. Look, if you were Europe and we weren't spending any money on climate, you were imposing I don't know what they're at, $80, $100 per ton on your businesses, I think you'd expect some consideration on the other end. So it's not unfair. It's not that they're being unreasonable, but we have to answer. I think that's the point of having this data.
Definitely. And was that a motivator, for you?
Well, I would just add, this is where I think it's important to talk about U.S. values, and they go beyond carbon. This is the human rights, right, the safety and other things like that. And I think this is a wonderful chance for us to make a case that we like to do business with people that share our values, and we're going to do that, right? And we're going to work for free trade where they share our values, and we're going to have that conversation where they don't share our values about how we adjust for that.
Okay. Another question from the audience. So after Prove It Act data gets released, what is the next logical legislative or policy step to help decarbonize U.S. industry, especially thinking about carbon disadvantages in other countries?
I'm just going to say, I think the market will take care of this.
Yeah.
Right? And I said before, consumers want clean.
I would say also, the other consumers who want clean are Japan and South Korea and EU who buy our gas. And one of the things that I constantly hear is our gas is cleaner than Russian gas. I don't disbelieve it, but I can't prove it. And I'd like to have that information. Again, I think if you think in terms of markets overseas, I think having that information will only be to our benefit.
Mm-hmm. So actually this next question is really related to that because it's talking about MMRV, so monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification. So if you can't prove it, but you think it's true, this MMRV framework is going to be really important to get at those questions. And so how do you see those efforts and protocols, best practices, efforts to standardize some of the efforts around MMRV playing into the policy conversation?
I talk about this a little bit separately to improve it in terms of fugitive methane capture, for instance, where, again, the demand I talked about for clean gas around the world has driven the industry to come up with a lot of innovations about how to measure methane. And we're better at measuring not just the presence, but the concentration of methane. We get different tools for different environments, windy environments, and so forth. Again, I think what you see is that we're driving toward more information, right? And that's not just a governmental, that's not just driven by the government, it's driven by consumer demand. So again, I think we're probably gonna find that maybe there's more information out there than we expect just because consumers have demanded it from industry.
Yeah, and I would just caution, when I hear government needs to figure out the answers, right, to standardize this, I would just caution, say government rarely does that well. Right. And what government needs to focus on is end outcomes without limiting necessarily like how we do it or how we measure it. I've already heard in my district, for instance, look, if the government mandates you measure it that way, here's the disadvantage. So I would keep us focused on end outcomes and be careful as a government not to get too prescriptive in how we get there.
Yeah. All right, so Grace would like to know, what was the hardest part about working together on this act? What was the most successful, and maybe, some of the other stuff you might not want to talk about?
Well, you may have noticed we just don't get along very well.
I think the hardest part of bipartisanship is, in general, is that there is a tremendous pressure for conformity here in Washington, D.C. It is a culture of conformity. You go with your crowd. You don't cross people. You don't raise a different idea. And if you do, Twitter will yell at you, and some people are uncomfortable with it. And people come here and they say, I'm gonna get to Washington, I'm gonna rock the boat. And then they get on the boat and they say, oh, it's rocky, let's calm it down, right? And just the notion of working with the other party is just it's sort of not universally adopted. But I think it's so rewarding and so essential because nothing happens here of any consequence and certainly of any longevity unless it's bipartisan. So, it's harder because you don't just get to sit around with people who agree with you and write down, what you think, your right answer is. You got to actually listen to the other side and figure out where. And John's been great. I mean, we're pretty good at listening to each other and learning. I learned a little bit about what he's got to face in Utah, and he's, obviously California's a whole different bag of chips. So I think it's just the hardest thing is just getting yourself in that habit, and then sticking up for what you come up with.
I love that answer, and I would only slightly add to it just a little bit more, and that is some of what holds things back here is the bureaucracy and staff who change is uncomfortable for.
Yeah.
And I think we ran up against some of that with this bill.
Right. The staff drives you to conformity too. So my staff, fortunately, I have to tell them, they get out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
Too bad.
Talking about other staffs.
Yeah.
They're all looking at you, right there. All right, well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We are moving now to a coffee break. So go out there, grab some snacks. You cannot bring them back into this room, so go enjoy out in the auditorium. We are gonna reconvene at 2:55 for the rest of the session. So thank you very much. Join me in thanking the Congressman.
All right, I think that's the end of our run.
All right, welcome back. Hopefully everyone is properly caffeinated. I thought that the first segment was really fantastic. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for coming back. Filling 5 hours of programming on climate and trade kind of seems like it's a lot, and at the same time, it was really difficult narrowing down our options of who to bring to speak. There are so many amazing thought leaders in this space, some of whom are in the crowd today, many of whom are in the crowd today. So we've got about 2 hours here. We've got 2 more bipartisan pairings of senators coming up. But first, we're going to hear from the Congresswoman from Colorado, Diana DeGette, who is a senior member of the Energy and Commerce Committee for keynote remarks.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that introduction. And I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing us all together for this informative event. It's really great to see such a wonderful attendance at this, because I think you'll agree with me, one of the most pressing issues that we're facing in our time is the climate crisis. And as I've been saying, in my 28 years as a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, climate change isn't a red issue or a blue issue. It's an issue that affects everybody, and it affects every state in this country and, of course, our world. So I truly believe we can get everything else right, but if we fail on climate, then that's all for nothing, because this truly is an existential issue. So as you heard, I'm a senior member of the Energy and Commerce Committee now. I'm also the ranking Democrat on the Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security in this Congress. And in that role, I've been deeply committed to finding bipartisan solutions that will help us transition to a clean energy solution. I know you just heard on your last panel from two of my dear friends and colleagues, Representatives Scott Peters and John Curtis, about the Prove It Act, which is a bill that I'm very happy to be a co-sponsor of. And I'm probably not going to be the first person to refer to him today as Senator Curtis. I just saw him in the hall on the way over, and I tell him every time I see him, I'm really looking forward to working with him when he's elected to the Senate in November on climate issues and other really important environmental issues that face not just the West, where both of our states are, but also the whole country. The Prove It Act is a bipartisan approach that ensures that America leads in clean energy production while also ensuring that we don't import dirty goods from our adversaries. A healthy future for our children and grandchildren depends on bipartisan efforts, just like that one, to aid our progress towards net zero emissions and the swift transition to clean energy. We really do need ambitious goals to achieve net zero, and the scientists all agree we need to be able to meet those goals by the year 2050. And so I'm laser-like focused on doing that. What that will do is it will require a clear path forward that leverages every aspect of energy production in the United States, while at the same time reducing the harmful impact of fossil fuels and carbon emissions. Time is of the essence here, because future generations are counting on those of us who are in positions to act now to do everything that we can to protect our planet. It took some time to get all of the members of Congress on board with this idea, and still all of the members of Congress are not on board with the goal of 0% by 2050. But I believe if Congress works with private business, with state and local leaders, and with people in NGOs and every other aspect, we can work, each of us, in our own niche to get to that resolution and to be able to get to that goal. Last year, I had the privilege of attending COP28 in Dubai, where, as part of the largest congressional delegation that we have had to COP in many decades, and where we met with delegations from all around the world. As you know, there were over 150 heads of state and tens of thousands of participants, including businesses, youth leaders, non-governmental organizations, and indigenous peoples, who all came together united in our commitment to tackle the climate crisis. At COP, nearly 200 nations pledged to transition away from fossil fuels, curb harmful emissions, and build a more sustainable future for all of us. This was really extraordinary, considering where COP was held and considering some of the resistance that we felt from some parts of the international community. But yet we were able to get this agreement from over 200 or nearly 200 nations. This collective action was a significant achievement for the health of our planet, and it demonstrates a strong and growing consensus on reducing emissions, investing in clean energy, and protecting vulnerable communities. During COP28, I was so proud to be able to sit on a panel and share the work we're doing on the Energy and Commerce Committee to advance those goals. My subcommittee really is at the forefront of driving energy policy, and I've been working closely with Chairman Jeff Duncan, a Republican from South Carolina, to try to find bipartisan approaches to our nation's energy sector. Everybody here knows, at least on an abstract level, the importance of bipartisanship and how it can unlock the door to collaboration on the issues that matter most to our country. And working with Chairman Duncan and also the chair of the full committee, Kathy McMorris Rogers, and also Frank Pallone, the ranking member on energy policy, really is a vital goal because the health of our planet can't be sacrificed to partisan politics. And in case you haven't noticed, we have plenty of partisan politics right now in this country and also around the energy issues. So one of Jeff's and my key focuses has been modernizing nuclear energy, which is critical for a clean energy future. Nuclear energy provides nearly 20% of the electricity in the US and is the nation's largest source of carbon-free energy, making up more than half of our emissions-free electricity. One consistent thread that I have heard since taking the ranking member position is the lack of incentive to recruit and to retain the workers needed to ensure that our nuclear energy facilities are safe, secure, and functional. In 2022, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission reported it was 23% smaller than 6 years earlier. And according to 2023 data, 26% of the Commission's workforce is currently eligible for retirement. That number is expected to rise to 44% over the next 5 years. So these statistics, along with the concerns from environmental groups and the energy community, were what pushed me and Chairman Duncan to write the Atomic Energy Advancement Act. This landmark bill enhances our energy supply chain, improves safety, recruits a highly trained and skilled workforce, and ensures that our nuclear regulations are up to date. It passed out of the House, you won't believe this, it passed out of the House on an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote of 365 to 36. Last month, even more unbelievably, it passed out of the Senate as part of a larger package. And just yesterday, I was so honored to attend a White House ceremony in the Oval Office with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Capitol, where President Biden attached his signature and enacted this bill into law. The law fundamentally changes the way we approach nuclear energy while helping reduce emissions and put Americans into good-paying jobs. And it will help the United States lead the world in transitioning to clean energy. In Congress, even though we passed this one bill, we still need serious action to meet these ambitious climate goals. That's why in the last Congress, I wrote the Clean Energy and Innovation Deployment Act, or CETA, a comprehensive bill that invests in clean energy technologies, establishes a clean energy standard, incentivizes methane waste prevention, and lowers energy costs for low-income households. This bill provides a path to an all-of-the-above approach to energy production, including solar, wind, nuclear, and traditional energy sources. It also encourages traditional energy producers to operate in a way that protects our environment and reduces carbon emissions. Several of the incentives from that bill, like the zero-emission electricity credits that encourage power companies to deploy innovative technologies that reduce emissions, were actually included in the Inflation Reduction Act that passed. I'm currently working on updating CETA due to the provisions already becoming law. It's a straightforward and comprehensive approach to achieving our goal of net zero emissions by 2050. And so I'm focused on doing everything I can in moving it forward. But that's just one prong of the approach. Congress has a responsibility to take as a whole on the climate crisis. We've made progress, as you've heard, but it's just the first step. Much of the progress is thanks to 3 historic bills that are cutting costs for working families, creating new jobs, and addressing the climate crisis. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided $1.2 trillion with a T to our nation's infrastructure, and the CHIPS and Science Act boosted domestic research and manufacturing right here in the U.S. And the Inflation Reduction Act was the most expansive climate action in our history. Already, these provisions have created over 271,000 jobs, secured over $350 billion in clean energy projects, and made communities more resilient against the disastrous impacts of climate change. That bill was signed into law in 2022, and we're continuing to see positive progress. So while we're starting to move in the right direction, as I said, we have more to do. Taking on energy production and transitioning to clean energy will take time, investment, and a commitment to renewable energy sources. I'm focused on delivering serious solutions that lower energy costs, protect our environment, and secure a healthy future for generations to come. I believe that with effort and commitment, we can do this in a bipartisan way because simply we must. So I look forward to working with all of you. Help us do this because our children and our children's children's generations are at risk. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Congresswoman DeGette. Next up, we have Brian Deese, who is no stranger to the international climate space. He served in the Obama administration and more recently as chair of the National Economic Council under President Biden. And he's been working on a new vision that he's here to tell us about. He's going to reserve a few minutes at the end of his keynote remarks for Q&A. So again, if you've got that QR code or that webpage still on your phone, if you want to submit questions for Brian, do so via that QR code. Well, there it's back. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Brian Deese.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here on a busy day in Washington, hot day in Washington, to talk about this incredibly important subject. I want to start by validating in the strongest possible terms the core thesis of this event, which is that we need to bring climate policy and trade policy together more tightly in ways that are more aggressive and more effective. And I would actually extend it broadly. In my last role in the White House, I was the director of the White House National Economic Council, the president's chief economic advisor, and I think we need to center clean energy policy more centrally at the core of our economic strategy as a country. So I'm very thankful to the organizers of this event and to all of you for putting your shoulder against that broad thesis in the different ways that you do that. I want to spend my time here today in giving you a brief assessment from my perspective of what I think it will take to actually do that, which is a Marshall Plan style effort to actually accelerate decarbonization in developing countries and make sure that it's the United States, not China or any other country, that is a reliable leader in this global effort. I am going to move really quickly through this. I want to touch on a bunch of things. Be very eager to get your questions, reactions, feedback as well. So first I want to start with some context that relates specifically to China, because we're talking here in a conversation that has to do with trade and climate, and you really need to start, in my view, with China, which is, I think over the past several years, we've made real progress in a bipartisan way in recognizing that a global model of trade, where we operate on free market principles and China does not, is not sustainable. Whether it was sustainable in the past, it's not sustainable with China taking the role that it plays in the global economy and the clean energy economy today. I think there's bipartisan recognition of this, and with good reason, because today what we see is facing a stalling domestic economy. China is engaged in a strategy of overcapacity externally and undercapacity domestically. It's investing in manufacturing goods in quantities far beyond its own domestic demand. It's working to flood markets with an explicit focus on core sectors that are key to the energy transition, including EVs, solar panels, and batteries. And while that strategy of over-subsidizing manufacturing for external consumption may have the impact of lowering prices temporarily, it does not build a durable long-term foundation for a resilient long-term energy transition that the world or the United States can depend on. And I believe that there is a growing bipartisan recognition of that reality. So if we accept that reality, then we have to accept that doing nothing in the face of that growing challenge is not a viable climate strategy, nor a viable economic strategy. And at the same time, strategies that seek to decouple completely China from the global supply chains, or to end all imports, or take other extreme measures are unrealistic and unhelpful in actually solving the problem. So what we need is a plan for the US to lead in a global effort to have a more balanced trade regime that serves the objective of massively accelerating the adoption of low-cost decarbonization technologies among developing countries and our strategic allies around the world. So here's the good news. We in the United States right now are building the core components of this strategy. Thanks to the action of congressional leaders like Congresswoman DeGette and many who are here today, we passed multiple very important bipartisan bills in the main, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act. And we have seen these bills working at historic scale in the United States. Total investment in clean energy was up more than 70% in 2023 over 2021. And importantly, emerging climate technologies like carbon capture, nuclear, advanced geothermal are growing at historic rates, a tenfold increase in investment over a single year. We are driving innovation that can drive down costs at scale here in the United States. And those investments here have the potential to make a global dividend. In fact, the emission reduction potential from those lower cost technologies globally is 2 to 4 times what the emissions potential is just here in the United States alone. But the adoption of those technologies, the dispersion of those technologies globally is not self-executing. And it's not self-executing in a way that helps American innovators, American businesses, and American workers. So without government leadership, it is unlikely to happen at the scale or speed that we need. And in particular, as China increasingly pursues this overcapacity strategy to try to dominate supply chains, if the US doesn't get into the game, then they will increasingly be the only viable alternative. And that's why I think this moment requires an effort on the scale and on the strategic importance of the Marshall Plan in 1947. Now, there is no question that the analogy to the Marshall Plan is overused, particularly by policy people, a Marshall Plan for this, a Marshall Plan for that. But I think in this case, the history is very instructive. Because in 1947, Secretary Marshall and President Truman found themselves facing a fractured world order, increasingly dependent on great power competition, and where they had to face a skeptical public, a war-weary public that was very wary of foreign aid and spending foreign dollars abroad. And in the face of those challenges, what they crafted was an explicit strategy designed to be pro-American and also generous to our allies. They put US companies and US economic growth at the center of that plan, and as a result, 70% of expenditures in the Marshall Plan were spent on products made in the United States on a wide range of sectors, from infrastructure to energy. And the plan gained broad approval, bipartisan approval, in a divided Congress because the case was made that we had built industrial capacity here in the United States during World War II, and the way to actually extend that economic opportunity for our businesses and the jobs associated with that was to win export share in growing markets, and Europe was chief among those. So today, we have an opportunity of a similar scale. Just like 1947, the world is undergoing a profound reshaping of global industry and supply chains. The post-Cold War era of integration of trade and politics and technology is giving way to fragmentation and competition. And at the same time, the global energy transition will be the largest capital formation event in human history, and it becomes more pressing by the day. And so I believe that with a Marshall Plan style effort, we can actually massively accelerate the clean energy transition in emerging markets across the world, but do so in a way where American companies and American innovators are driving that transition, rather than watching from the outside or even worse, stepping back and seeing China step into the breach in ways that are not consistent with our values. So what does that actually mean? What would it look like to actually put a Marshall Plan style emphasis behind this? Well, first, a critical step in this effort is to arrive at a more balanced trading regime. And that's why this convening is so important, and it should be based on a measured but strategic use of trade tools like tariffs in a more active and strategic way. We need smarter trade authorities, such as carbon-based border adjustment capabilities, which is why I am so glad to see the bipartisan conversation about moving that idea and that concept forward today. You guys are having lots of conversation with speakers about the policy designs of those issues, so I won't belabor them other than to say, I think we have a unique opportunity right now to harmonize and coordinate this approach, not only among developed countries, not only to deal with what Europe is already pursuing, what the UK is likely to pursue, but also to bring together a new global coalition that increasingly recognizes the unsustainable nature of China's export-driven strategy in this area. I think it's incredibly noteworthy that in just the last several months, countries from Brazil to Chile to India to Thailand, Turkey, and Vietnam have all announced that they are investigating or imposing trade remedies against Chinese overcapacity, including in key clean energy sectors. This creates an opportunity for the US to lead by building our own strategic trade tools like carbon border adjustments, and then work with those countries and those allies to create a more harmonized global approach. I also think that we can do this in a way that empowers rather than penalizes the least developed countries who are not driving the emissions problem globally, but have the most at stake for climate impacts as well. So I think border adjustments and increased trade tools is an absolutely necessary first step and a first part. I think it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I think second, the US needs a new clean energy finance authority and capability on the scale and the vision that the Marshall Plan laid out. This needs to be muscular and flexible to actually make the US the engine of clean energy deployment. Now, I've been in this field of climate finance for a long time, and one of the things that I have to acknowledge, even though it's hard to reflect as an American, is that the conversation in capitals across the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and other areas of the globe that are becoming increasingly strategically important to the US, is a conversation that goes along the lines of, when China shows up, they bring a checkbook, and when the US shows up, they bring a checklist. And what that means is that the United States is increasingly not in the game of actually being a partner to help finance the investments in infrastructure, energy, and technology necessary to accelerate the clean energy transition, because we're not bringing the capital and the flexibility and the partnership that it entails. Now, of course, we do things differently. We operate with a set of values that we shouldn't compromise in this context, and that is different from an approach that China or other non-market-based economies would bring. But we can be much more nimble, much more flexible, and much more aggressive at showing up in capitals across the world and being proactive partners in this effort. Again, the good news here is we have promising models to build on. The US DFC has significantly expanded its lending into energy-related projects over the last couple of years. Domestically, the Loan Program Office of the Department of Energy has demonstrated the ability to scale dramatically and provide smart strategic lending to help facilitate innovative technology in this space. But we don't have the scale or the flexibility necessary to actually meet this moment in a real way. And to be clear, to meet this moment in a way that puts US companies and US innovators at the head of actually gaining market share in these growing global markets for these technologies. Finally, in addition to border adjustment capabilities and clean energy financing capabilities to support US businesses expanding export opportunities around the world, we need more stepped up energy resilience authorities to actually address diversification in key clean energy supply chains. We cannot build a durable clean energy transition in which one country owns 90% or 95% or 100% of key choke point supply chains that could become strategic problems and opportunity and obstacles for growth around the world. One specific example is to build off of the model of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which has been used strategically over the course of the last several years, but in just the last couple of years, you've seen used to address the market implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and to intervene now in markets to repurchase oil and help to stabilize global markets at the same time. A smartly designed critical mineral reserves that includes physical reserves where feasible, but is focused on actually addressing the price stakes, the price spikes, and providing stability in these markets in a way that actually will create more diversification is something that we should think carefully about as well. And there is bipartisan support emerging for these types of ideas, whether it's from the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. In the US, an increasing number of companies and firms calling for a more active and energetic tools for intervention. And also, we're seeing our allied countries abroad moving in this approach as well. In May, for example, Korea began to build a domestic lithium reserve at the national level. These are the kinds of initiatives that we want to be leading and building clubs and partnerships on around the world. So in sum, I think we have a historic opportunity today. We can build off of the success of American clean energy innovators, and we can do so in a way that helps to expand economic opportunity here at home and meet key strategic allies in a way that is generous and in our strategic and national interest as well. But to do so, we are going to have to summon the kind of scale and will that brought the Marshall Plan into existence almost, about 3/4 of a century ago. This, I believe, is the kind of approach that we can build the same type of coalitions around that we worked on, for example, in the infrastructure bill, that was bipartisan and practical and focused on what are going to be concrete, specific ways to help communities across the country. With the increasing examples we're seeing across the country where communities and places that have been too often left behind are now seeing economic opportunity connected to the energy transition. And how do we put them in the global game so they can benefit by being leaders in that effort as well? So with that, I want to encourage the optimism, the energy, the enthusiasm that you all have to try to bring bipartisan solutions to bringing trade and climate together. I want to encourage the kind of ambition and vision that was embodied in the Marshall Plan and that we could re-invoke today. And to the degree that you've got them, or to the degree that we have time, I'm happy to take your questions as well. Thank you.
Brian, our first question of the day is, does your new Energy Marshall Plan, your vision, require the sidelining of the WTO framework?
First of all, I would just say it's the odd voice of God questions is really fun. I was going to make somebody raise their hand and own that question, but it's a great question. So whoever asked it, they don't need to do that. What I believe that what it requires is for the United States to be prepared to lead and lead in a global coalition in a way that is not inconsistent with the letter of the WTO, but will require leading in advance of rather than sort of waiting for the WTO framework. The WTO framework has gotten too slow, too brittle, and if we have to operate solely within the way that the operating framework has come to pass, as opposed to the letter of the operating framework itself, then we're going to set ourselves back. So what it requires is global leadership and a willingness to build new global coalitions, not necessarily to fundamentally rewrite the core charter and the core visions embodied in the WTO, but will require significant WTO reform. And the last point I'll just make, just to reiterate a point I made, because for those of you who have not been in this space as long, it's incredibly notable. The idea that you have Brazil publicly challenging Chinese dumping of steel is new. You know, we used to operate with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, who would operate as a bloc and would generally seek strategic alignment even on issues related to trade. And so I think that creates a new opportunity for the US to step in and lead. And that's going to require us leading with partners, with allies. And my hope is that the WTO can come along and can catch up. But if not, you might need more fundamental reform.
Our second question of the day is, you mentioned that the US needs a new financial tool. Where would you imagine that tool would be held? Could it be possibly in modifying the DFC?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it comes down to design details, of which there are many. What I would say is we need to have significantly greater scale and significantly greater flexibility in how we bring finance tools to the conversation when it comes to going to a place like Indonesia or Vietnam or Brazil and helping invest strategically in accelerating decarbonization in those markets. More flexibility in terms of actual financial tools, debt, equity, guarantees, risk insurance. We should be coming with a flexible toolkit that allows us to actually solve the problem most efficiently with the most efficient deployment of taxpayer dollars. More flexibility in terms of prioritizing US firms, US investment. If we're using US public capital to advance clean energy infrastructure projects in these jurisdictions, we should, I believe, be unapologetic about the idea that we're going to put US innovators, US firms, and US job creation at the head of that line. And more flexibility in actually being able to operate nimbly and quickly and get to committed deals that will be in the interest of US business, but also the global economy and global emissions reductions more quickly. And I think that there are a number of ways that we could get there. I think that you could envision and imagine reforms to the DFC that get you there. I think that what we should do is think about how do we bring all of the resources that we have within the federal government to bear to do that as aggressively and effectively. We shouldn't have to build underwriting or technical capability, for example, to look at advanced geothermal investments in multiple parts of the government in a siloed way. We should bring those together. And I think that there's multiple ways to do that. And part of what I'm hoping to encourage in this conversation is good creative thinking on how to do that. It's always difficult. It's always difficult when you're doing reforms that particularly executive branch agencies can get their backs up and say, well, where's it going to be and who's that? I would encourage the conversation to say, can we try to get to a shared vision and then figure out the most effective way to bring different tools to bear.
Brian, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
This time, you're not getting rid of me quite so quickly because I get to moderate the next panel. And I just want to reflect for a second on the fact that we have a huge crowd. It's been so great. I always say that there's actually a lot of climate nerds and a lot of trade nerds, but there are very few climate and trade nerds. But maybe you're proving me wrong. This is a really nice crowd. Or maybe there's just a bunch of climate separately trade nerds here who are, cross-curious, trying to learn. And I just, when we started working on this 2.5, 3 years ago, I don't think we would have been able to fill a room like this. There was just like a couple dozen people, that you would want to talk to that had been thinking about this. We've really just come so far. And I thought what Brian Deese had to say was so interesting. He also mentioned critical minerals, which is a topic that we hadn't covered quite so much today. I'll note that tomorrow morning, we at BPC are working with the American Critical Mineral Association on an event that will feature Senator Hickenlooper, and it will coincide with the release of our new report on critical mineral demand-side policy. So if you're interested in critical minerals or demand-side policy, please look out for that. And now I'd like to bring to the stage Senators Sheldon Whitehouse and Bill Cassidy. Please give me Thank you.
Have a seat.
All right.
All right.
So these are no strangers to most of you. If you think at all about border carbon policies, These are probably two of the names you know. They've introduced actual, honest-to-God legislation implementing a border carbon adjustment. We're not talking about a data bill here. We're talking about actual border carbon policy. And that's amazing. We've got a senator from Rhode Island that's a Democrat, a senator from Louisiana that's a Republican, and they both have bills that use an emissions performance standard as the basis for this carbon border adjustment. There are plenty of differences between their bills, but there's really interesting and key similarities, which makes me really optimistic. And again, we're going to save a few minutes at the end of this chat for audience Q&A. So if you want to submit questions, feel free to go ahead and do that now. And if I'm not feeling too selfish, I will ask them instead of my own questions. First question, Senator Whitehouse, is to you. The EU is going through the process of implementing their new carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM. It's getting a lot of attention. Some people think it's a really great, terrific policy. Some people think it's not designed well. There's a difference of opinion there. But one thing that is quite clear is that they are acting, and the US, up to now, is not doing much. So my question for you is, how should the US be responding to the EU CBAM? And what is the case for US leadership in this policy space?
Well, let me start at the very 50,000-foot level, which is that it's pretty clear right now that we have frittered away so much time dealing effectively with climate change that the remaining avenues to find a path to climate safety are extremely few, and all of them require a price on carbon pollution. You just can't have it be free to pollute and get to climate safety, period. So the CBAM, in that sense, is a terrific thing, fussing about the design aside, because it is, and because they're going to stick to their guns, and because if you don't want to be tariffed, you're going to have to step up yourself. When we did the IRA, we got a lot of complaining out of the European Union. And when they complained, I would say, tough bounce, suck it up. If you don't like it, do your own. And I think those exact words should properly come back to us in response to the EU and now UK CBAM effort. The good news is, to state the obvious, it's bipartisan. The other good news is that we are not just two senators having a conversation in hallways, but we have a very substantial and robust support network of think tanks, both liberal-leaning and libertarian-leaning, who are working together pretty seamlessly to provide at least intellectual support for us. And the last piece of good news is that even if we sit on our rear ends and do nothing and just let the CBAM hit us, that will be good for the US economy, because the discrepancy between what the tariffs are on our producers and what the tariffs are on Chinese producers are enough to offset the wage and pollution cheating benefits of running your supply chain into China. So it is expected that there will be significant job and manufacturing growth in the United States as a result of the EU CBAM, and we only accelerate that further if we kill off the headwind of tariffs on our products going to the EU and the UK. So it will be good, and again, working in bipartisan fashion to try to get towards an ultimate compromise, it will be a lot better. And that's setting aside the climate benefits of avoiding havoc and catastrophe. That's just pure economic jobs calculations. So I feel pretty good about all this.
Yeah, good jobs and avoiding havoc and catastrophe seem like two nice things.
Yeah. And it's not too bad to work bipartisan.
As a representative of the Bipartisan Policy Center, I will agree with that.
Thought that might be a point you'd like.
Senator Cassidy, the Louisiana legislature passed a resolution at the state level last year supporting a border carbon adjustment, stating that the US Congress should, and I'm going to quote from this resolution from the Louisiana state, enact a trade policy that holds high-polluting countries like China and Russia accountable for their pollution and promotes American economic development and the rebuilding of United States supply chains, particularly in rural communities, by rewarding American businesses and workers for their superior environmental performance while penalizing global polluters. That's the Louisiana State Legislature. So can you help us understand, like, why is this policy space, why are these sorts of policies so important and good for Louisiana?
And did you write that?
I could have, but importantly, I didn't. It kind of rose spontaneously from the people there. And so I'm going to, if this is kind of Sheldon's side of it, I'm going to give my side of it, and you'll see that despite apparent differences, they are very complementary. What my state legislature acknowledges, and which Sheldon alluded to at the very end of his remarks, is that the United States has made incredible progress in decreasing our emission profile. We now have an emission in absolute amounts, not per capita, not per unit of economy, in absolute amounts, lower now than we did in 1988. 1988 is here, this is where we are. Now, this has been part of marginally renewables, marginally regulations, principally. It has been the substitution of natural gas for coal as a feedstock for utilities and as a feedstock for chemicals and plastics instead of oil. So, we in Louisiana are very aware of this. We are very aware that natural gas has literally fueled the declining emissions associated here. When Sheldon speaks about our emission profile being lower relative to the Chinese, not surprising. They continue to use coal for their utilities. They don't turn on their scrubbers, so they don't comply with kind of norms on environmental regulations. My state legislature recognizes that if you're a chemical company in Louisiana complying with US environmental regulations, using natural gas as a feedstock, or perhaps nuclear-derived energy, because we have a couple big nuclear power plants to run the operation, then that your emission profile is much lower than the Chinese. And so if you're going to go over to Europe, and they're going to penalize the carbon intensity of your good, as Sheldon mentioned, we are at a natural advantage. Now, let's build upon that. If the United States similarly puts in such a foreign pollution fee, is how I refer to it, a foreign pollution fee, in which goods coming into the United States have the avoided cost of non-compliance with regulation layered over the cost of the product coming in, then our goods will be at a competitive advantage in the United States. And then if you extend that once more, if the United States and the EU team up with Japan, Australia, Canada, UK, you name it, in which anybody who wishes to import into one of those countries has to comply with kind of international norms on controlling emissions, then we're taking Western standards of environmental protection and exporting them in return for access to the richest markets in the world. Now, that is all layered into what my state legislature is advocating. And that's why, frankly, I think that the foreign pollution fee and trade is incredibly good for American workers, incredibly good for our economy, and I could go further saying it's incredibly good for our national security.
And I love how you bring in the international aspect of, we're talking about a US-based policy, but there's plenty of room to work in coordination with allies to increase trade between allies. We're not talking about a policy that's intended to decrease trade generally. It's about who we trade with and what the incentives are on those other countries to decarbonize if they want to import into our country.
Yeah, ideally you have a common trading platform with the EU, the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, Mexico, and that enormous common platform sends an incredibly powerful price signal out to the rest of the world to clean up their pollution, because we can clean up US carbon pollution and methane pollution, but there's a whole world out there that needs to address its problems, and the price signal is the best way to get there. You can hector, and you can encourage, and you can, plead, but a good solid price signal gets a lot more attention.
And as proof of concept, in the USMCA, there are certain environmental and labor standards required of Mexico. Now, we don't typically think of Mexico as being the most kind of environmentally sensitive country. But if you look at the amount of pollution or air emissions associated with producing a ton of steel, and let's say in the US it's 1. In the EU it is 1. In China it's like 2.64 or something like that. In Mexico it's 1.2. The Mexican emission profile is almost the same as the United States, which shows that using trade as an instrument to promote the commonality of concern for emissions has worked with Mexico. And I think that kind of use case tells us it could work with others too.
So, the two of you clearly agree on so much. You've each written detailed, thoughtful pieces of legislation. And you made some different design choices. And everyone here should have received a copy of our new report from BPC that we released on Monday, laying out the different design options for designing this kind of policy, the pros and the cons of each. And if you read it, you'll see, we lay out which are the ones that are in the Foreign Pollution Fee Act from Senator Cassidy and which are the ones in the Clean Competition Act from Senator Whitehouse. One of the key differences between your two bills is that Senator Whitehouse, your bill has a strong domestic component, and you apply that same domestic emissions performance standard to imports, whereas Senator Cassidy's bill is really an imports-only policy with no specific domestic component. So, Senator Whitehouse, how do you think about that difference between your two bills? How important do you think the domestic piece is to the overall success of the policy?
Well, I think just to start with the politics, it's a hell of a lot easier for a Democrat to advocate for a domestic price on carbon pollution than it is for a member of the Republican Party to do that. So it ain't all that tough for me. I think that what we're both doing is trying to build support for the concept of responding to the CBAM and dealing with the climate issue using the levers of trade policy and economic price signaling to cause results, good, efficient market behavior. And at the end of the day, I think our bills are likely to come together. How they come together is TBD. We haven't pre-negotiated anything. But I do believe the European Union folks, when they say that they will not waive tariffs on any country's exports unless that country has a domestic price on carbon. And so at some point, American industry is going to have to look at that and make a decision about, do we want relief from tariffs, or do we want to continue the free-to-pollute business model that has caused so much damage? And I think as that begins to come together, you'll see more and more of a conversation about that, more and more economic studies about the winners and losers and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, we have a bipartisan, bicameral bill, and we're going to find different ways to get there. And it may or may not include a domestic carbon price, but I think if the EU sticks to its guns, and I think the EU will, the economic imperative ultimately becomes powerful enough to overwhelm the political cautions.
So, I like that you do think that there is a way to eventually marry these two bills together, though I note that you mentioned there is no prenuptial agreement.
There's no
on how we get there.
I don't like that image. Bazan, can I address that too?
Yes, sir.
One, wherever you are, Lily Roberts, that's a question that's up here right now.
I know, her timing is perfect.
So hats off to you. I oppose it not because I'm a Republican, because I think it's terrible policy. It is an incredibly regressive tax. Now, we don't have to imagine this. If you look at the story in the New York Times about the woman in Maine who can hardly afford her heating oil, and she has to borrow from her church in order to afford to heat her home in the winter. are the people in Western Massachusetts who, because Massachusetts has the highest utility cost in the nation, have a difficult time affording their utilities. Imagine if you increase that more with a carbon tax. It is a regressive tax. It falls disproportionately upon the poorest people in our society. Now, we can say we're going to pass it through government back to them, but government has sticky fingers, and you tend to employ a lot of people who get a lot of benefits, and they end up earning six-figure incomes to work from home with no accountability as to whether they're really showing up. I'm not making that up. That is the reality today. Now, let's tell the American people, you're going to pay a lot more for your utilities in Maine, air conditioning in Louisiana, so that we can pass back through some tax break to you. Politically, this is not only just bad policy, politically it's a non-starter. But let's go to a couple other of the objections. The EU is not going to dictate our policy. If the EU says you're going to do it our way or we're not going to do it at all, frankly, we're a bigger economy than the EU. They have a vested interest in partnering with us. But let's just take on their argument that they want to have a cost of carbon. Technically, they don't have a cost of carbon. They have a cap and trade system, and in that is imputed a price on carbon. The economists would also say, though, that compliance with a regulatory regime to decrease emissions is also an imputed price of carbon. So there's three ways to tax carbon. One is to tax carbon. The second is to have a cap and trade, as the Europeans do. And the third is to have the imputed cost of compliance with the regulatory regime. We have a very expensive regulatory regime, very expensive, but we're pleased for it. It's controlling our emissions. That's what we want to make China pay for, which currently they're not paying for. That is a very real cost, and to imagine that it is not is to deny what the economists would tell us. Now, one more thing I just have to say, because you're a sophisticated audience. I spoke specifically of point source carbon tax. Again, think of, I don't know, the carpet in the room. But there's also non-point source, which is fuel, jet fuel. We already have a carbon tax on that. It's called a gasoline tax, or a diesel tax, or a jet fuel tax. So if society wants to say for non-point source, gasoline, we're going to jack up the gasoline tax, as what California has done, to try and discourage the use of. But that's going to be something which is done not as a public policy on the federal level by and large. I think that will just be kind of flowing naturally from what states do.
So you can see we're going to disagree on this.
Yeah, a little bit of a disagreement.
And I don't want to, prolong the argument indefinitely, but I do think it's important to recognize that a pollution fee that is actually paid by the polluter is a very different thing than taxing the little lady in Maine who Bill Cassidy mentioned. She might never see the result of the pollution fee because, first of all, the entity that is being penalized for polluting might pollute less, so the fee goes down. And second, as is the case right now, they might be making so much damn money that if you believe in market competition, they're going to have to absorb a good deal of that as they try to compete for the business of the nice lady from Maine. So the notion that this is a tax on the end user as opposed to a penalty on the polluter, I think is the one point that I would add to the conversation.
Thank you. All right, next time we'll have to bring in Senators Collins and King so they can
Tell us more about the
respond
little old
to the
lady from
little
Maine.
lady in Maine.
Yeah.
Senator Whitehouse.
Ooh, better be careful there, brother.
A lot of people think of you as a climate champion. But it's also worth noting that you are the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. And the US is not exactly in a great fiscal situation right now.
Correct.
Deficits are high, debt is high. Next year, $4 trillion of tax cuts, including cuts to individual income taxes, are set to expire. So, in that fiscal environment, what is the case for this climate and trade policy as a potential revenue raiser?
Well, there are a couple. First of all, as I think Bill and I agree, the CBAM itself and a carbon border fee in the United States, in addition, boosts American manufacturing and American jobs and the American economy. So you are in fact lifting the economy, and that creates more revenue. You grow your way out of it. Now our troubles are too big to just grow our way out of. We're going to have to deal with revenues, and if you're looking at a revenue proposition, depending on who you want to get revenues from, people who are polluting a lot look like a much more appealing place than people who are, say, working and raising income taxes. So I think there's that. And the third piece, which we've been focusing on in the Budget Committee, is that a third of our roughly $30 trillion debt comes from economic shocks that we didn't prepare adequately for. One was the 2008 mortgage meltdown, and the other was the COVID pandemic. That's $10 trillion plus that they just blew up and added to our debt. So we need to remember that that happened and look ahead to what the coming economic shocks are. And I would argue that there is enormous, very well validated warning of an imminent economic shock coming from climate catastrophes. And I think, I hate to say this, but I think we're actually in the early stages of that in Florida right now, as the property insurance market in Florida melts down. And as the chief economist of Freddie Mac said, the way this operates is you first have your insurance get too expensive to afford, and then you can't get insurance at all. The companies have withdrawn. And then you can't get a mortgage, which means that you can't sell your house because you're only dealing with buyers who can pay cash, and that crashes the supply and demand. So you go from an insurance crisis to a mortgage crisis to a property values crash. And avoiding that by being more responsible about addressing climate havoc, I think is time well spent for Congress.
Senator Cassidy, you released your Foreign Pollution Fee Act last year.
Say that one more time.
You released your legislation, the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, last year. And kind of a lot has happened since then. The White House announced a new climate and trade task force. We heard from Ben Beachy earlier about that. We've seen the Prove It Act advance through the EPW committee on a strong bipartisan vote. Now it's introduced in the House, also bipartisan. How has the moving, the momentum on this issue, along with, I think, renewed and increased stakeholder engagement, shaped your strategic thinking about how to move forward in this policy space?
So, very good question. And you've mentioned all the positive things. Let me give you my elevator pitch as I would speak to a colleague, and then I'll build from there as to how I think it goes from there. In our country, you cannot separate energy policy from climate policy, from economic development policy, from national security. While we've been paying to decrease our emissions, China has been ignoring norms for emissions control, lowering their cost of manufacturing, attracting jobs from around the world to China, strengthening their economy, and they've used that economic growth to fuel military activism. So our energy policy, our climate policy, our economic policy has all played into national security. If you put in a foreign pollution fee or carbon border adjustment mechanism, then China has to comply, or else they pay a fee. But either way, it's somewhat of a drag upon their economy. It equalizes the playing field as to where economic growth occurs, and I'd like to think that more of it would occur here relative to there. That drag on their economy will then kind of put the brakes on their ability to pay for militarization. And of course, energy policy feeds into this. Now, if I'm speaking to a hawk, I'm saying this is a policy by which we can help defeat Chinese militarism, at least take a little bit of the air out of it. If I'm speaking to a climate hawk, I can say, well, Sheldon always knows this, but this is a way to get the world's largest emitter to begin to decrease their emissions. If I'm speaking to my Louisiana legislature, I said you can't help but notice that if the Chinese used our natural gas instead of their coal, they could better comply with lowering their emission standard. And that would be economic growth in the United States because so many people are involved in our energy industry. Now, you put it all together, you've got a message for whomever you're speaking to. Robert Lighthizer, now speaking of, whatever you think about this, President Trump looks like he's going to be our next president if you believe the polling. Robert Lighthizer has been very influential in his trade thinking. In his book, No Trade is Free, he recently wrote in favor of a carbon border adjustment mechanism for everything I just described. But you mentioned that the White House just had their their carbon border kind of trade issue. So I think that there is a bipartisan recognition that China ignoring international norms on pollution control have allowed them to have the economic growth that has enabled their militarization. So I put all that together. There's going to be headwinds. There's going to be people you got to explain it to. But when the China Commission over on the House side is understanding this issue, talking about this issue, when Lighthizer is writing about it and endorsing it, when Trump wants to put tariffs on the Chinese goods, just a kind of carte blanche, this is actually more of a rational approach. And let me say one more thing. I do not want a hot war with China. None of us should want a hot war with China. This is a way to kind of put the brakes upon their economic growth, to bring them into alignment with what we consider norms in a way which is not a hot war. One of our questions earlier suggested that this could be a form of protectionism. I point out the Chinese can get rid of this tariff just by complying. Think about that. In fact, I mentioned this to a Chinese minister from the Chinese government, and he goes, we could live with that tariff. He knows what he's dealing with as opposed to it being arbitrary. So I actually think that this is incredibly good foreign policy, incredibly good economic policy, and incredibly good climate policy.
So it feels like you're saying like this is where we can get the China hawks and the climate hawks to work together
and the economic
to push off the war hawks.
The war hawks don't want war, but certainly if China continues to militarize, you'd be naive to assume that we're not supposed to do something. This is a way which, again, just puts a little bit of a drag. And that drag, slowing them down, maybe they have to divert more resources to the welfare of their people as opposed to building another battleship.
All right, so we're going to move on to audience questions. We've had a few cycling through here. The one that caught my eye just a second ago was on least developed countries. How does a policy like you would envision affect least developed countries? Is there a way to design it in a way that we think is fair, but is also still effective?
I would say that, first of all, you can avoid deeply impoverished countries. Second, you could pair it with very significant capital investment to help Indonesia, for instance, move from coal power to geothermal. It's the ring of fire. They have geothermal all day long. So, but for many of these poorer countries, the capital constraint of moving to the new technology is an impediment. Once you actually put a price on carbon, then there's a revenue proposition to making that move, which brings investors. So it actually helps them in that sense. And then finally, if you're looking for the really clean technologies of solar and wind, you have enormous capabilities in the global South. And the prospect of developing those capabilities, once there's a rationale for doing it, once it pays to put the cables under the Med so that Europe's demand can be met out of Saharan solar fields, things like that, you end up, I think, with this being a winning proposition for the global South. But it is an issue that has to be watched carefully along the way, because you can't say, great, it's going to be a winning proposition for you in 2040, but you, Mr. Minister, need to go back and get elected now, and it's going to suck for you now, but you're just going to have to, tough bounce and wait for it to turn your way. So it's an issue that we have to watch and manage. It's a moral imperative as well, because it was our pollution that created this mess. But I do think that in its pure natural state, it is actually immensely advantageous for the Global South.
Senator Cassidy, we're about to wrap this, but I want to give you a chance to answer.
I'll be brief.
Yeah.
Our bill relies, it will complement what Sheldon just said. Our bill relies upon behavioral economics. Right now, if Vietnam wants to outcompete China, they've got to lower their manufacturing costs less than China, which means that they have to even be more kind of callous regarding environmental standards than the Chinese. Remember, cost to control emissions. But wait a second, if now the country which has the cleanest product avoids the emission, the way that they outcompete the Chinese is not by lowering the standards of those of the Chinese, but by increasing the standards of those of the US, the EU, et cetera. And so we flip the current dynamic on the head of how this works. Now, secondly than that, we also in our legislation say that if you're a low middle income country, we will grandfather in your existing base, but expect anything built from henceforth to be compliant with Western standards. If you're a high middle income, which China and Russia are high middle income, we don't grandfather in products. And so we give them actually a little bit of a head start. They're not as wealthy, they don't have the same ability to adapt as the Chinese, and so we kind of compensate for that. So we think between those two kind of mechanisms, behavioral economics and grandfathering in, we create that pathway for those less well-off countries to outcompete the people with whom we wish them to outcompete.
Senators, thank you so much. This was terrific.
Thanks for having us on, Zan. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Zan.
Good to see you.
Next up, I have the pleasure of bringing to the stage some of my absolute favorite thought leaders on this topic. All three of our next panelists are members of our newly announced BPC Advisory Council on Climate and Trade. Our moderator is BPC's own John Jacobs. Please welcome to the stage Dave Banks, who we've already seen earlier, Jane Flagle, who's at Stripe Climate and formerly White House CEQ on industrial policy, and Maureen Hinman, co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator.
All right. Thank you, Zan. I've been waiting for this panel because this is the wonky panel. This is when we get into policy details, really flesh out what a lot of people have been talking about with the Clean Competition Act and the Foreign Pollution Fee Act. And we have a group of panelists that are not only incredibly smart on this issue, but also big personalities. So I think it'll be a fun panel of going back and forth. And I'm just going to try to set them up and try to get out of the way of their hot takes. So we just heard from Senator Cassidy and Senator Whitehouse. We now have two visions, a Democrat vision and a Republican vision in the Clean Competition Act and the Foreign Pollution Fee Act. And BPC's new report that you should all have really compares these bills and some other options when it comes to policy design details. And luckily, we have one of the authors sitting right here. So Dave, can you walk us through how these two bills converge, but also what are the pinch points that we need to be thinking about in building a bipartisan coalition?
Well, of course, I'm going to plug the paper again after you, because it does spend a lot of time looking at the differences between the two current versions of the bills. Look, I think that, look, this is kind of the first round of legislation. Right, I don't think any of us actually think that one of these bills is going to become law. That's okay, because I think getting the conversation moving, it was incredibly important to the overall effort in developing this relatively new policy. So what I would kind of like to do, not to shake it up too much, but kind of look at the current versions and try to forecast where I think things will land, right? And I do think that over time, you're going to have more similarities than what you currently see. I know that Zan and the senators talked about the absence or the presence of a fee on less efficient domestic producers. That's obviously the biggest difference right now. And look, I think that for Senator Cassidy and his approach, it does represent a red line for Republicans. You're not going to have any kind of Republican support for imposing a fee on domestic producers. Again, I think that from a Republican point of view, this is all about geopolitics. It's about commercial interest for the U.S. And it's, I mean, I think it also is part of this whole conversation related to a domestic carbon tax, which Republicans largely oppose. So, but look, with the similarities, I think over time, some of these differences, and let's say, look, two of the big differences now, one is related to sort of covered goods, and the other one is focused on international partnerships. Now, I will say this as we kind of move forward, just the pure politics of this. I think for a lot of affected industry or potentially affected industry, they've kind of looked at this and gone, okay, neither one of these are going to really move forward at this point. But what do we like? What do we not like? Well, first of all, you can't cover industries that don't want to be covered. That is, that's just not going to work politically. And then, the question is, what industries are going to want to be covered? Well, there's a similar thread here in that the industries that want to be covered, like steel, aluminum, cement, a lot of those industries have been decimated by the trade regime. And they see a U.S. CBAM design as a lifeline. Okay, but this also, and by the way, from the Republican perspective, again, our goal is our chief goal, look, it's all good to reduce global emissions, of course, but our chief goal is to increase U.S. competitiveness, right? And try to rein in control of the global supply chains that China currently enjoys, right? And so, we want to make sure that the industries that we cover are the ones that want to be covered, right? If we have an industry or a segment of U.S. industry goes, we don't need your help in protecting or promoting our commercial interests, okay, give them the pass. But I think that this will affect kind of how we view the ultimate policy design. So it may be a much more narrow sectoral approach initially. But then this feeds into the international partnerships piece, right? Because I know a lot of folks have an interest in international partnerships, but look, I think for the affected industry that has been decimated by the trade regime, they're looking at this and going, okay, we want to monetize our carbon advantage. We don't want all these exit ramps and all these opportunities to create international partnerships with Vietnam and these emerging economies and developing countries that, where China could just offshore and relocate its industry. So I just, so I don't know what the future of these international partnerships is going to look like. No. Because I think from the Republican perspective, and a bellwether here would be where the steel industry is, right? If the steel industry says, we don't like this, right? We don't want all these off-ramps and potential partnerships, I think the Republicans are going to say, okay. And ultimately, Republicans will support the steel industry and workers. And one quick thing, now there's this potential exception, and that would be with low carbon technologies that acknowledge that because of the supply chain requirements, there is a need for international partnerships, right? Because we can't reshore everything. So there could be kind of differences among the sectors.
Maureen, a lot of what Dave just highlighted where the bills converge really align with what Silverado published as what should be the main objectives of a climate and trade bill. So leveraging the US carbon advantage, securing supply chains, building international partnerships. What do you see this as the magic sauce for building a bipartisan coalition?
First of all, congrats on the report. It's excellent. It's always, from our perspective, really comforting when we see another major think tank put out a report and we kind of are in rough alignment. It makes us feel like we've done our homework and maybe you've done yours too, so congrats. So I think there's kind of like three big buckets on this issue. First of all, just you need a policy that's technically practicable, right? There's a lot of things one could do, but it needs to be something that businesses can do that will not increase their compliance costs. We've heard a lot about compliance costs today and the burden on U.S. businesses, and U.S. businesses will comply. A lot of their rub with their domestic competition, as Senator Cassidy had mentioned with the import competition in their domestic market, is that they have very high compliance costs. They play by the rules, and often even in their own market, they're facing competition that does not have that same burden. And then, of course, having measures in place that make sure that it is transparent, that your calculation system is universal and comparable, and that you avoid circumvention and cheating. You have measures in place to make sure cheaters pay. And then the second area is really just avoiding manufacturing taxes on US businesses prior to leveling the playing field, especially vis-a-vis US businesses and strategic polluters like China and non-market economies like China, wherever their sort of facilities may be domiciled, right? I think we've heard that point that these facilities can move around. And so I really think that this is a test to the US government's ability to actually do something effective after many years of sort of trade battery with trade policy, and for businesses to actually reestablish some of their trust with the US government's ability to protect them in a growing global market. I think after you do that, you have that's really plays to this sort of political viability. After you do that, I think that the idea of a carbon tax becomes a lot more palatable if businesses feel comfortable that whatever they have to pay, their competitors overseas are also going to have to pay for. And then that leads to the third is just really creating incentives for international partnerships, right? And so the idea is that you would have a system or a club that others actually want to join. And this is an issue where the US actually has a real advantage because as it stands, the CBAM is a punitive measure, right? It says you will do this type of policy or we will slam you with a bunch of taxes. And it doesn't really incentivize decarbonization in the manufacturing markets. And so the second sort of layer of political viability is really not just about domestic political viability, but international political viability. And that really comes from forming plans and measures that are going to incentivize the US way of doing things as opposed to an EU way of doing things, or worse, a China way of doing things. So hoping that we kind of are thinking sort of strategically on those two levels of political viability.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of this conversation is really about industrial practices. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And Jane, you used to work on industrial decarbonization at the White House. Can you walk us through how a climate and trade bill touches industrial decarb, but also the way that international partnerships play into global industrial decarb?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. We've already heard today, not only from Brian Deese, but from the policymakers and senators who engaged today about the ways in which industrial decarbonization, which is fundamentally about reinvesting in and reinvigorating and cleaning up our manufacturing base, is an incredible opportunity, not just for the climate, but importantly for the economy and for our national security. And now I'm going to say something that most industrial decarbonization experts no longer want me to say, which is that it also is kind of uniquely challenging. And it's certainly uniquely challenging relative to other sectors of the economy that we need to decarbonize to limit the risks of climate change. And that is because, unlike, for example, electricity, these are highly price-sensitive, trade-exposed commodities. And so while we talked in the Biden administration, and they continue to talk about the need to use a whole-of-government approach to tackle some of our major challenges, there's nowhere that is more true than when it comes to industrial decarbonization. There is no single policy that is going to be sort of a panacea for addressing these really important and interrelated challenges and capturing the opportunity. So I would posit that leveraging the tools of trade and leveraging market access is not just advisable for accelerating industrial decarbonization, it is actually unavoidable. And that's true both for accelerating domestic decarbonization and global decarbonization. And I want to just call out two things. I think there are two climate-related objectives of better linking climate and trade in these kinds of ways that are worth calling out because they sometimes get lumped together. One is there is a carbon loophole today in the world. Like half of our industrial pollution problem is the result of unfair trade practices, full stop. Like we have to address that problem. Secondarily, and in some ways at least as important, we need to catalyze further decarbonization and emissions reductions. But there are two problems here that we are trying to solve simultaneously. And maybe one other sort of philosophical point before we say a few specific things, which is there's been a lot of conversation about the role of existing international institutions, whether it's the WTO or the UNFCCC. And I actually think we're at a really exhilarating time to be talking about climate and trade, because I think there's a growing recognition that these institutions are in fact human artifacts and that they are instrumental to achieving objectives. They are not inherently good in and of themselves, actually. And if they are not working and to solve our most pressing challenges, we have not only the opportunity, but the responsibility to change them and or to work around them. Just a couple of things I want to highlight quickly about the way these border adjustments might be designed to maximize their climate impact. First, this has already been mentioned in the category of accelerating more domestic decarbonization. Much has been made already about the ways that, especially if we cooperate with other countries, we can capture growing market access for clean American industries. And that is, a world where that is true is much better than a world where that is not true, both for the climate and the economy. The second is there actually is an incentive, or could be, depending on how such a tool is designed, for concentrated industries in the US who would be subject to these regimes to reduce their emissions more aggressively to, for example, reduce the national standard, whatever it might be that we are applying to foreign entities, to capture more market share. Third, there is this possibility of such a thing potentially applying domestically. And then fourth, also, we talked about a border adjustment potentially being a generator of revenue. It's entirely plausible to imagine using some of that revenue to bolster the already very exciting investments in both the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law in industrial decarbonization domestically. I will stop there.
Well, that's great. And I want to start getting into the weeds a little bit more into some specific issues. So maybe do a bit of a hot round here. We've heard a lot about how to incorporate least developed economies. We just heard the senators talking about it. Jane, you just talked about our current paradigm, how we essentially incentivize reshoring emissions to least developed economies. How can we think about incorporating them, Maureen, how can we think about incorporating them into a climate and trade package and prevent loopholes that would incentivize players like China to reshore to those countries?
Thanks for the question. I mean, this is the essential tension. How do you deal sort of with legitimate developing countries and their legitimate interests versus a very large industrialized country with a lot of capacity who is in many cases the #1 producer of environmental technology in the world, raising its hand and saying, I'm a developing country, I should get to do this, that, and the other. So I think the first is, and as the senator mentioned, was, start with income groupings. Don't let countries self-identify, but then really look at those countries' capacity to perform. Not just how they're performing, but what is their capacity? What do they make? What do their best in service businesses do? And what are they capable of? And so what you do second with developing countries is you freeze their performance in time. You say, look, everything that you will produce in this country here forward, every facility you build will be at this level, unless the investor is from a higher capacity country. Then those facilities have to be at the level of that country's capacity, not the developing country. This is really valuable, first because it closes that loophole for circumvention, but it also goes a long way to facilitating a thing that developing countries have been very frustrated at in UNFCCC and other negotiations, is that they want tech transfer, they want the technology, they want the expertise, and they want the dollars. And so by kind of incentivizing investment dollars around capacity, you're able to give some of that tech transfer. And then third, and this is relevant to the CBAM and other issues, is just don't steal from poor countries, right? The current CBAM is in a position the EU CBAM is in a position to basically tax developing countries, many of whom were former colonies, for the infrastructure that the colonial powers put in place, profited from and then left, right? The decommissioning costs, the cost for operations, these facilities get older, they get dirtier, right? And so imagine how you would feel if you were trying to decommission a coal-fired power plant and you were told, good news, I'm gonna start taxing you on that plant that I put in place. It's very frustrating. That anger is really real, and I visit the WTO a lot, and the developing countries are very mad. So I always think that the best way to kind of think about these trade policies is like, okay, what if we did the opposite, right? What if America did the opposite? We flipped it on its head. So we let them keep their revenue, as long as they agree to use a certain what they would have spent on that revenue towards environmental purposes, right? Let them have their money. Let them invest in their own economies, and also require that when they do those investments, they're buying U.S. technology, right? So now you're promoting U.S. clean tech exports. You can also imagine sort of building in some linkages into things that we care about around critical minerals and supply chains. And then the final thing is that on developing countries is that we really need a system of fungibility around carbon credits, right? Much of the value that developing countries have is in really efficient carbon storage, right? And so having the fungibility of credits, like let those countries and also other countries avoid paying taxes by sequestering carbon wherever it's the most efficient, by building that backbone of a system. You know, as I often say, carbon credits don't have any feelings. Like they don't actually care where they're sequestered.
I think that perfectly tees up my next question. Jane, you spend a ton of time thinking about carbon dioxide removal nowadays. We heard from Congressman Peters about the importance of CDR. How should we think about incorporating CDR and carbon credits? What are the pitfalls to avoid, but like, what are the benefits we can get out of this?
I think it's a really important question, and I guess there's three mechanisms I can think of. One is the one I think most people think of, which is essentially basically offsetting your emissions in lieu of paying the fee by investing in a carbon removal project elsewhere. I think that is something that should be examined carefully and could be a potential opportunity for sure. It is very important to get the rules right around this. The thing that you are doing in lieu of reducing a pulse of fossil fuel emissions needs to be equivalent to that pulse of fossil fuel emissions. So it has to be a permanent carbon removal, which tends to be a much more expensive carbon removal. So it is not the same, it doesn't play the same kind of cost containment role that conventional carbon credits often sometimes are thought to have played, and that's very important for the integrity of the atmospheric outcome, actually. The second is insetting, which is to say that we spent a lot of time at Frontier lately looking at approaches to permanently remove carbon removal that utilize alkaline feedstocks specifically, and that could be steel slag, mine tailings, other kinds of industrial waste. And to date, many of the companies who produce these things haven't yet thought of them as potential assets to bring to bear to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and I think that's a really exciting possibility. And then the third is we can all fight about how to use the revenue from a border adjustment, and one potential use of such revenue, of course, would be investing in high-quality permanent carbon removal that may in fact be critical to fully decarbonize the industrial sector, some of the emissions from which are going to be very expensive to mitigate.
Awesome. Dave, you were on the National Security Council. How can we leverage a border carbon adjustment policy to secure US supply chains? I'll plug now, BPC has a critical minerals report coming out on this topic tomorrow, so check that out. Yeah, how can we bolster these supply chains?
Well, this is pretty fast. I don't see Republicans supporting a U.S. CBAM policy design that doesn't do that, right? Because I think that's clearly one of the primary sort of objectives, for Republicans, and I think for Democrats too. But certainly for Republicans. And look, if we create a design that actually rewards emissions, environmental performance, okay, we're going to see greater investments and accelerated investments in manufacturing and in extraction and other activities here in the United States. So just because, as we discussed before, as Katrina laid out, and other folks have done so as well, just given our relative carbon efficiency, okay? But I will say this, the last thing I'll say related to this is that if you don't have permitting reform, right, if we can't actually build stuff here and get it permitted, then all these, the trade benefits, the potential trade benefits we're talking about just aren't there. There will be some, but will not get the benefits that we're talking about and emissions reductions that we're also talking about.
Yeah. Thank you for plugging permitting.
Because you got permitting thing at BPC too.
Report. Yeah, check out BPC's website for more permitting reports. I also want to touch on, the European Union has the CBAM coming into place in the next couple of years. Japan, South Korea, and Singapore have all thought about implementing one of these type of policies. I feel like this international trade pressure might make this more of a priority for Congress. But I want to ask y'all, and really throw this out there, is what is the US giving up by responding to these international trade pressures rather than getting out in front?
You can be a system maker or system taker, and generally the world's better off, and we're better off when we make the system. The EU is extremely good at doing this. They're extremely good at creating their own rules in relative secret and then propagating them all over the world in order to, with scalpel-like precision, promote their exports, promote their industries, promote their tax base in this case. But CBAM, let's be honest, I'm grateful to the EU for this opening effort. It's created a lot of ambition around the world, but it's a deeply flawed policy. And this creates an opening for us in turn to come up with something better and do right alongside our partners. Now, I'm not sure we really care in the United States because we do know that for the most part, the US is going to be a beneficiary of the CBAM. But I do think we need a policy against these sort of bad BAMs, as I call them, because we will need our own policy in order to provide the legal basis to defend against bad policies as they emerge. And if you don't have your own policy, it's very hard to go to trade court and say, we're really mad about this policy, and they're doing it wrong, it has effectiveness issues, they've impinged on my right to regulate when I myself am not regulating in the space, right? So having your own policy really creates the foundation for your defensibility and that sort of legal basis.
It also gives you political leverage if you actually have a bill on the table that you can use to talk about the reality of what might happen, especially when you're trying to negotiate good BAMs or climate clubs or anything of that sort. Yeah.
Sounds like a song.
Yeah, I can see a report title in the making.
It reminds me of my kids like Flintstone vitamins.
Yeah, yeah.
BAMs.
So, and here's just a fact, right? I mean, neither the United States nor any developed economy has the market power alone to force China or wrest control of global supply chains away from China, period. And if we don't figure out how to develop, back to your point, like a US-led system, we can't work things out with the Europeans up front. We got to be able to work with the Koreans and the Aussies and the Japanese to come up with our system and then get the Europeans to play ball with us. And a lot of my Republican friends, look, Republicans don't like the EU very much. I think Democrats like the EU more than we do, and that's okay. That's okay. Maybe you're.
You're hot take.
I'm independent.
But let's just be honest. I mean, we have to figure things out with Europe because we can't achieve our geopolitical and commercial goals without some kind of meeting of minds with the European Union. Whether we like it or not, that's just the way it is. And I think the importance of the climate piece with trade is that, and a lot of folks, Republicans would say, look, climate activism is a religion in Europe. Well, I don't think you get Europe on board a common approach with us vis-a-vis China and trade without the climate piece.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's clear to me that there's a lot of bipartisan convergence, but also a lot of technical details we're going to need to work out here. So please give a round of applause to our great panelists.
We have a treat in store next. We're getting towards the end of the program. We've got one more fireside chat, and then we've got some concluding reflection remarks from BPC's president and CEO. I just want to, again, thank everyone for being here. It's been such a great conversation. I'm just amazed at the crowd, at the interest in this topic, and the momentum we've seen from the last several years up until now. We've heard from 2 members of Congress that have introduced a bill in the House. We've heard from 2 senators that have each introduced legislation, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, in the Senate. But we have yet to hear from any senators who have actually passed a bill that's gotten a vote. And this next pair introduced the Prove It Act in the Senate and passed it through committee, not yet through the Senate floor, but through committee with a strong bipartisan vote of 14-5. I just want to say that these 2 members have been really strong bipartisan leaders, thought leaders. We work with them a lot at BPC. Senator Coons' team historically has been a bit of a pipeline to BPC. We've had 3, I think, AAAS fellows who were once Coons staffers that have come to the energy team. 4 actually, 4 Coons staffers over the course of a decade. And Senator Kramer's team has been just really a joy to work with. It's really interesting to see just like the pairing of, previously we saw Rhode Island and Louisiana, now we're seeing North Dakota and Delaware. And now that I've filibustered long enough and they're actually here, I would love to introduce Senators Chris Coons and Kevin Kramer, moderated by Sasha Mackler, who's the Executive Director of the Energy Program at BPC.
All right, I'm back. You thought you were done with me, but I'm here to help bring it home. We've had a great program today, and we are the cleanup crew. We're the last conversation here before we wrap and have the reception. And we've heard a lot today. We've had a really packed panel. We've heard a lot about climate and trade. We've heard a lot about the rationale, some of the things that have been happening in the administration, some of the things that are happening here on Capitol Hill. And would love to kind of now turn to how you 2 are thinking about this, which I think is a real privilege. You're leaders in your caucuses. I've been thinking about these issues for quite some time, and I think you'll find here that the audience is quite expert on these issues themselves, and I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of a dialogue here. We'll save some time at the end for questions. We'll get them to pop up on our screen. So for those of you in the audience, please remember you can scan in the code and put your questions into the mix, and we'll try to fold them in to our conversation. So thanks again for taking a little time with us. I'm going to start with Senator Kramer. You're from North Dakota, which is energy state, oil and gas state in particular. And I think a lot of people here in the audience wouldn't naturally think of a linkage between an energy state, oil and gas state, and this intersection with climate and trade policy. Can you help us make that connection?
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's always great to be with my friend Chris Coons, who's in the middle, right where he belongs. I have to be right up front, tell you though, in all honesty, I would probably do some things I wouldn't normally do if Chris asked me to. And I think that's, well, don't get carried away. I do have limits, but really, you guys, the relationships still matter in this town and in this institution, in particular the United States Senate, and I'm honored to be a friend of Chris Coons. But how do we draw the link? I think the link, while you're right, on the surface, at the shallow end, it looks odd. But you don't have to drill down very deep, if you excuse the expression, to see an obvious connection. I believe, in fact, one of the sayings around North Dakota is, a Bakken barrel is the cleanest barrel of oil. If we believe that we're so exceptional that we can claim that, and I believe it's true, but if you've never seen a vial of Bakken crude, it's darn near looks drinkable. And I wouldn't suggest it, but
spoken like an oil and gas.
It's very light and sweet. And so what does that mean? What that means is because of the incredible high standards, environmental standards of doing production, because of the high standards of shipping it, all of those things, I believe we do have the cleanest barrel of oil. If we believe in that exceptionalism, we shouldn't be afraid to prove that exceptionalism. And if we can prove that exceptionalism, and climate is a global challenge, we ought to be able to make the case that in a growing market, a growing global market for oil and gas and other forms of energy, and it is a growing market, we become the solution just by virtue of our own excellence. That doesn't mean we don't continue to strive to be better at it, but we ought to stop beating ourselves up and start taking advantage of the fact in the global marketplace that we're good at this. So I think empirical data helps us actually market the very product that that we see as sort of the antithesis of clean.
That's great, thank you. So really good for the US domestic economy, good for US jobs, good for global emissions and the global environment. There's a lot to like here, right? Senator Coons, you've had a major focus not only on environment, but on international relations in the work that you've been doing. China has come up time and again in the conversation today. Would love to hear your thoughts on how these geopolitics work out, thinking about China, but also the rest of the world. How should we be thinking about the policies in international relations?
Well, first, thank you. We really are the cleanup crew, as you said in introduction, Sasha, because the point of our legislation is to prove and demonstrate and celebrate low emissions products in the United States, energy products and industrial sector products. So we are trying to be the cleanup crew.
I like that.
And we have a bill on housing together.
Yeah.
We first started working together on that housing bill, and then I saw the H.R. McMaster and Kevin Kramer piece and said, wow, this is fascinating. He deserves the credit for the good idea. I'm just dragging on his lead on this. I had an interesting debate with a colleague hosted by the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Okay.
It was Senator Rubio of Florida. This was last year. And we got to the segment of our debate where we were talking about climate. And Marco sort of launched into the criticism that we would be restraining American industry unilaterally in order to achieve a global emissions reduction climate goal, and nothing that we would be doing here would reduce the skyrocketing emissions of China, Russia, and India. And I said, I agree with you. He looked at me. And I said, that's why we have to have a global solution that is market-based, that will reduce emissions and provide competitive market pressures globally on China and India and Russia to reduce their emissions. And in my view, an initial step is to achieve what you were just hearing about from my friend Senator Kramer, which is to be able to demonstrate to the world that we can produce energy and we can produce heavy industrial products more cleanly and more efficiently than our competitors. And then the second, you asked about the geopolitics. The EU has a CBAM. There is a carbon border adjustment mechanism. They're not studying it, they're not talking about it, they're not debating it. It's in place, it is coming, and it is going to be imposing tariffs on American exports to the EU, which is a major market. And the EU is frankly not that happy broadly about the massive subsidies we are providing through the Inflation Reduction Act. We both broadly agree that we need to reduce emissions and we need to deal with climate globally, but we've taken different directions. Theirs is more regulatory, ours is more incentive-based or private sector-based. We've got to find some way to harmonize these two. Speaking for me, my ultimate hope is that we are able to figure out a way that the countries that can produce heavy industrial products, so cement and glass and aluminum and steel, in the lowest emissions, most efficient, most sustainable ways, get a competitive market advantage globally against those that can't. And the more we can prove the point you were making about, I'm not sure I would say that Bakken is sweet. I'd be interested in your tasting notes on a barrel. Does it have a smooth and clean finish? Does it have a light and airy nose, slightly fruity? But all joking aside, globally, there is a commitment to reduce methane, right? Because natural gas methane is a highly influential climate warming gas, has great consequences. If our oil and gas industries figured out how to reduce methane emissions more than any other in the world, that's worth noting, celebrating, and competing on. But we don't currently have a mechanism to drive that. In my view, the Prove It Act, I think this is partly why it came out of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in January by such a strong vote, at least get the data. at least be able to benchmark and at least be able to make the case for American industry. And then we may have more of a leg up in our negotiations with the EU about their CBAM and its costs on us, and about how together we address the dirty products, the intensely dirty products of the steel and aluminum that Russia and China and India have been dumping into our markets for decades. When I've described this to folks like the steel workers or companies that produce heavy industrial products in the United States, they're thrilled. They'd like to have us be able to help them make their case domestically and globally.
Yeah, no, there's it's a very strong argument there. And as we think about, not only international dimensions, but the political dimensions here in the U.S. with respect to, the ways in which we might find a path forward for these ideas, Senator Kramer, you have very solid conservative credentials.
I'm a mean-spirited right-winger.
We have watched. we have watched you. As a leading Republican on a variety of issues, and I think there's no one really that can argue with that. But you've been on the sharp end of some political attacks when it comes to your support of these ideas, especially for, I think, the mischaracterization that what we're talking about here is really just another way of implementing a carbon tax.
Yeah, okay.
And I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
So a couple things. First of all, the legislation that we wrote is very specific and emphatic about the fact that this data in no way can be used to establish a carbon tax. But that aside, there's pieces of legislation to have a carbon tax. There's a CBAM bill that doesn't require, in fact, I would submit to you that if you don't support a carbon tax or a CBAM, well, Chris already made the case. Our competitors and our trading partners already have CBAMs. In other words, there's already a global CBAM. The question then becomes whether we're going to fight back with empirical data or if we're just going to pay the tariff and take it, as opposed to level the playing field. I think a lot of that conservative, the sharp end of the conservative jabs really comes from people who haven't thought through it very far, which is why we need to continue to make the case. Because I think Chris made the most conservative case for it just a little bit ago. He made the conservative case. I just think a lot of people, their reflex to the word carbon is so impulsive that they don't really think through it. I've never had anybody, after I've explained it in some detail, in fact, I love to challenge them and say, do you believe that the 24 most carbon-intensive industrial products made in the world, do you believe that we do it cleaner than anybody else? And if they say yes, then I say, so what are you afraid of? And by the way, the data we're talking about already exists. We're not asking the Department of Energy or the EPA or anybody. I do want to correct one thing. It came out of the EPW committee, not Energy and Natural Resources Committee. I didn't understand how it got in EPW myself, and I'm on the committee. But anyway, I'm glad it was there. That said, we're not asking for new data. There's a lot of it. In fact, many of the people in this room have participated in establishing that. You all have, right? The CLC has. And so we're just asking them to gather it, do the comparison between the United States allies as well as adversaries, and we could go through lots of it, but it's really quite clear that we may be the cleanest in certain areas, and where we're not, we're the second cleanest in certain areas, and I just think it's a good conservative argument. Here's the challenge, though, that what I worry about a little bit is I don't ever want the data to be used to put us at a disadvantage. The data should be used to put us, and I believe it would, put us at an advantage. So even if you're afraid of a carbon tax or a price on carbon, wouldn't you rather have empirical data than arbitrary data? I think you would.
Right. Yes. No. Information is power. Right. And there's a big value proposition, for our U.S. companies here.
No, we are addicted to dirty, cheap stuff from China, but we have to get over that too. We have to look for friends to do business with, and people that have high standards, because our industries are paying a tax. They're paying a tax on the high standards to meet the compliance of producing in the United States. And I wouldn't change those compliance standards. I just want to recognize the value of them.
Got it. Got it. That's great. Well, you know, in thinking about how you have been putting together the Prove It Act and sort of having your discussions with your colleagues in the Senate and the stakeholders, I'm sure you both have some interesting anecdotes related to the conversations that you've been having in the Senate and elsewhere. Do you mind sharing one or two with us?
I already said it, but I just, like, to me, how this whole journey began was that Kevin stepped out in an interesting article with General McMaster, who was Trump's national security advisor, talking about the implications for our national security of having a trade policy that is data-based and that advocates for American domestic manufacturing. Folks in this town like to think that, you know, there's this sort of far left and far right, and we literally don't talk to each other. I read the article and went, what a great idea, Kevin. Maybe we could work on that. And to his opening point about you have to have relationships, it could have just been a passing comment, you know, great piece, yeah, fine, don't ever want to talk to you. But Kevin was open-hearted enough to say, well, is there something we could do together on this? That's the essence, that's the beginning. And then you have to have talented staff who actually take the idea and the casual conversation and turn it into substance. You know, the most we can do is express interest in moving forward. It has been a long grind to get this to where it is. I am thrilled it has been introduced in the House. I understand you had the co-sponsors here earlier today.
Yes, we did.
Also, you know, look, there are more aggressive regulatory proposals, and there are others who say they don't want to have any data. I think at the end of the day, in the conversations I've had, a bipartisan path is the only path that's going to work here. And having bipartisan commitments to know what's going on and to have reliable data strikes me as an important beginning.
Some of you have heard my expression, I reject the notion that every transaction requires a loser. And unfortunately, this town's built on, it's not enough for me to win, you have to lose as well. And I think the beauty of the Prove It Act is that for free traders and or fair traders, Prove It has a real value. If the climate's your number one concern, it has real value. And the fact that it has value to people who care about emissions shouldn't prevent people who care about fair trade from being on board with it. And yet that is much of what we come up against. So you ask for an antidote. I mean, back in North Dakota, I do have some people that are pretty upset about it. I have some really strong supporters that are really pretty upset about it. But they do have a hard time arguing about it beyond, oh, this is the slippery slope argument. And to which I say to them, the illustration I've often used is, okay, so if you're driving down, if you're going south on 7th Street in Bismarck, which is a southbound one-way, and in your Corvette, and 3 semis are going north on that southbound one-way right at you, do you go, I'm right, damn it, and I'll show them? No, you're gonna get run over and you lose the fight, but you stuck by your principles. Chris said it well. We're living in a world that's demanding reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, you can deny it, you can worship it. Doesn't matter. Everybody's somewhere in a spectrum, and there's a winning formula here for everybody if they just think through it. And if we can articulate it well enough to our friends and doubters.
Well, that's great. I mean, that spirit of bipartisanship, you know, we're really hearing it here, and obviously that rings a bell for us here at the BPC. So, you know, Prove It Act passed out of committee 14-5, very bipartisan, which is, I think, nicely positioned now, right? But for what? What's coming next? Do you think? What's your anticipation for the fate of that bill?
Chris is going to get it attached to NDAA. Okay. I don't. So let's face it. We're not exactly breaking records in legislating right now, and I don't anticipate we're going to do a lot of major legislating between now and November 5th. But I do think we are going to have a very active lame duck, and we'll see what shapes all of that. Having said that, is this ready for to be attached to an appropriation or something? I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I do know this, that what appears impossible today can become possible like that.
Right.
And so we'll be open to all of those opportunities. But at the very least, if Chris and I have to get back together next year and start over at the beginning, we will have some momentum.
Have fun doing it.
And I will have fun doing it. And I do think, I think the EPW vote was significant in that there were some people who weren't convinced until the actual vote came forward.
Sort of a forcing function.
It was a little bit of a forcing function. I think there's another one of those ahead. I would say this, in the election we're looking at right now, we have on the one hand the current administration that cares deeply about this issue. But we have a Republican opponent who cares deeply about trade policy,
right,
and cares deeply about who rather likes tariffs, shall we say. So I actually do think we're in a moment where there's a winning opportunity to advance the legislation, if not by the end of this year, maybe sometime in the next session, right?
Yeah.
I've had several bills now, several different changes in administration that I've been working on really hard with a Republican friend, and we thought this administration might come in and a different administration came in. But we had built a bill that was enactable either way.
Yeah.
And that's what I like about this. Look, President Biden and the current leadership team in the administration has really focused on revitalizing American manufacturing and in reshoring and friendshoring. And I think this fits well with that agenda. They also are quite forceful on climate and advancing climate goals that I support and share. That isn't shared by his opponent, President Trump. But as Kevin just said, the move to protect American manufacturing and to disadvantage other countries dumping their dirty products into our country, that sounds as much, if not more, like Trump as it does like Biden. So, I mean, I think this is something that has legs, no matter what the outcome is in November. That's the kind of legislating that in the end succeeds.
Aligning incentives, it doesn't happen a lot,
right,
but sometimes it's natural, and sometimes you get a little creative, and I think that's what we've done.
Yeah, no, I mean, for the Prove It Act and then just for the issue in general, that's a theme that has come up throughout our conversations this afternoon, is just it really can probably proceed in either scenario, a second Trump administration or a second
Can I
Biden
just tell you too, Chris's idea on he talked about the housing, and I know we're not talking about housing, but the housing legislation, very similar. Similar in how it's been positioned. We'll talk about that next year.
Very impressive.
Yeah, okay, we're starting to get some questions rolling in here. How do we see the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum fitting into the future global trade policy? Any thoughts on that?
That's going to depend on who the president is. But look, I do think, I'll just dive into that for a moment. I think we need clarity about how trade and climate will work together. The Biden administration has a working group on how to use trade policy to advance climate goals. And the global sustainable steel and aluminum effort was really born out of an attempt to reconcile the IRA and the CBAM, and has had some success, but has not gone as far as I had hoped. There's also, frankly, critical minerals issues that we need to work through. In the broader geopolitical context, we have close partners and allies, and we increasingly have opponents, even enemies. And in a clean energy transition, knowing that we're able to produce steel and aluminum and have access to critical minerals and their processing, rooted in countries in North America or with whom we have trade agreements and security alignments. This is NATO week, after all.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
It's a good reminder.
32 heads of state are meeting here to celebrate 75 years of the most important security alliance in global history. And the first thing the Norwegians said the last time I went to visit Norway was, hey, by the way, we got every critical mineral you could want. And we want to work with you in partnership. So the global sustainable steel and aluminum partnership is, I think, going to eventually blend in some ways with our work to try and secure our supply chains of critical materials and minerals.
Right. Senator Kramer?
Well, growing up in the Fargo area, I'm very fond of the Norwegians. And my great-grandfather's farm in Norway is a beautiful place. But anyway, I've talked to the Norwegians as well about exactly what Chris is talking about. I actually think that the friend shoring of a lot of this supply chain, value chain is still not as clearly understood as it needs to be. There's a lot more work to do. Chris does more than most people added up. But there are tremendous opportunities. And on Monday, I was over at the Canadian Embassy, being a founding co-chairman along with Angus King of the ACES committee, or ACES caucus, and visited with Justin Trudeau, gave a little tough love on their NATO contribution, but talked a lot about Canada is another one of those countries pretty close to us, you know, I can see it from home, that is very mineral rich.
Right.
And could use some help, you know, from us in providing both a market and maybe some resources to mine them better, cleaner, all that. I just think there's a wealth of opportunity in Chris.
There's a town in Ontario named Cobalt, Canada.
There you go.
I mean, they are sitting on some of the greatest mineral resources on Earth. So.
A lot of opportunity there as well. So Sean has asked the question, what are the main objections you encounter from those opposing border carbon adjustments, and how do you deal with them?
It's going to make all my cheap stuff cost more. That's the main objection. The main objection, it's not an irrelevant objection. I mean, there's no question that by allowing, you know, normalization with China, for example, and other countries that produce things cheaper, we've, you know, consumers have been advantaged, right, by cheaper stuff. The problem is that in the bigger context, there's a much higher price for that. And so we, you know, again, we have to make that case that, okay, it's cheaper stuff, but at what cost in other areas, including global climate and issues and other pollution issues, workforce, you know, labor standard issues, giving, you know, providing an opportunity for our enemies to build their own treasuries. I mean, there's just lots of reasons to push back against that, but that's the number one issue, that you know, we'd benefit from that cheap stuff.
Yeah.
I say, hey, let's lift our quality of life and our standard of living at the same time.
Couldn't agree more.
Anything you want to add?
In talking with folks about the bargain that we made decades ago, we have deindustrialized much of the heartland of the United States. We have accepted a country that has lower environmental standards, lower labor standards, lower governance standards. Look, the Uyghurs and their horrific mistreatment in Xinjiang, that's also the area from which much of the source materials for the solar cells that they dumped in our country. There were 3 solar cell manufacturers in Delaware 20 years ago, a big one in Newark, Delaware. They got wiped out by cheap imports. And when we ignore human rights and labor standards in other countries and say, oh, I just want a cheaper solar panel for my roof, we are not doing right by the values that inspired the creation of NATO, that inspired a whole generation of Americans to go and fight for freedom in other parts of the world. And bluntly, if we want to see that manufacturing back in this country, and if we want to stabilize the small towns all over our country that lost those good manufacturing jobs, we have to be willing to look hard at what that inequality is. We have financed the very rapid industrialization and the sophistication of the research and the technology of a country that is globally aggressively competing with us. Not just, you know, who can make more Christmas tree ornaments or who can make more cheap tires, but for access to global markets and resources and for leadership on the world stage. I think that's clearer today than it might have been in a discussion 10 years ago.
Right.
And I think a lot of the American companies that charged into the Chinese market 30 years ago with no thought to what it might mean for the loss of our inventions and innovation or what might be the consequences. I mean, look, lifting 500 million Chinese out of poverty, encouraging their joining the world system was not an obviously bad idea when, you know, both President Bush and President Clinton really argued for it. Today, I think there's pretty strong bipartisan consensus that China is our toughest global competitor, and we should be willing to say to people, you need a better quality of living and a better standard of living, and investing in America is the better way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really compelling argument, of course, but I couldn't agree more that we've come a long way and starting to appreciate that. I mean, if you just look at this room, 2 years ago, if we would have tried to convene, it's been mentioned already today, if we would have tried to convene a conversation on this topic, you know, it'd be just a very small group that was thinking about it. And now, the enthusiasm and the appreciation for not only the need, but the opportunity here, I think is really, we're starting to really see that in tangible ways. So we appreciate the fact that you're continuing to drive it forward on Capitol Hill. We can't obviously predict what happens in the election.
Oh, I can.
Okay. Well, would love to hear your
We can pray about it.
A lot.
Yeah. But as we think about the next Senate, would love to hear your thoughts, Senator Coons, on the bipartisan caucus that you have underway, and what do you think the priorities are, and will this be part of what you're trying to accomplish in that? With that,
Senator Braun and I had a great event earlier today. This is the Climate Solutions Caucus that in this Congress has had 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats. This was on geologic hydrogen, which is an interesting, relatively recent discovery, I'll say, that there may well be abundant naturally occurring hydrogen. That's not something that was widely viewed as credible among geologists. They thought it was so mobile that it would simply go up into the atmosphere and it would not be captured. And we met with the head of the U.S. Geologic, the USGS, head of RPE, and then 2 entrepreneurs who have started companies that are really looking at the geologic hydrogen space. 2 pieces of it. I'm not answering your question, am I?
I'm sure you'll get there.
One is what occurs naturally, and the other is what could we do through stimulating the production of hydrogen? And I don't think I fully grasped this until we set up this event today. There are large places where there are existing geologic formations close to the surface where you do fracking, essentially, but you inject steam and you get clean hydrogen out with no hydrocarbons. And it really has some intriguing prospects. What is the future of that group and that discussion? Well, Senator Braun is going to go on to likely be governor of Indiana. Senator Romney is retiring, and quite likely Congressman Curtis might join us. I'm very hopeful that Senator Kramer might become more active in the Climate Solutions Caucus. I'll simply say, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'll simply say that I'm very hopeful that no matter who is the majority or minority, no matter who is the president, that we'll have a bipartisan group of senators who are interested in having substantive conversations about policy, in meeting with the CEOs of major companies, in hearing what's emerging in terms of making America more industrially competitive and how do we deal with climate, and that it'll continue to be a robust and productive group.
Well, we look forward to that as well.
Me too.
What he said.
Okay. Well, look, we've gone a little bit over time. We appreciate your engagement here and your patience, and really all the leadership you've shown on these issues. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks,
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Great job. Thank you all for coming out today. You know it's a successful meeting when people linger to the end, and it was a really energetic and fruitful conversation. So thanks to all of you. Thank you to our speakers, our panelists, who helped shed light on the current prospects for a domestic climate and trade policy. And thanks to Sasha and the energy team and all of my colleagues at BPC. Sasha, I'm thanking you. Good job, all that. See you at the drinks. We're at a unique moment in history, as we all know, one at which a changing geopolitical landscape and a changing climate, changing supply chains, and so forth bring us challenges that we've discussed today. At BPC, we pride ourselves in seeing around the corner to identify the ideas that can garner support across party lines, and we've heard a lot about that today. We've been working hard to help advance this set of issues, luckily, because the politics of climate and trade are unique, and we have the opportunity to meet several national goals at the same time if we work together. We can counter China, lower global emissions, support domestic manufacturing, and strengthen our supply chains. It is clear from the bipartisan legislative proposals that we've talked about this afternoon that this issue is really gaining traction. I mean, you can almost get hopeful about life in DC. And this policy approach can also improve our fiscal situation, so it's a twofer. At BPC, in the coming months, and of course into next year as we approach the serious major tax and budget debates that we have, we are leading discussions with those key stakeholders around the connectedness between these issues and our growing national debt. We also looking forward to engaging at the cross-section of all these issues and the other things in our portfolio at BPC, including housing and healthcare, education, and of course energy. We also applaud the creation of the White House Climate and Trade Task Force and hope to continue seeing more bipartisan spirit and action in the coming years. We're excited to announce our own Climate and Trade Advisory Council, which if you look on your little code, you'll see the members thereof. which will help guide our work, and it's an august group. You all should have received, it's been mentioned many times before, and it's worth a read, our new report, Designing a Climate and Trade Policy for the United States. It's really excellent and has been flattered and complimented, and rightly so, earlier today. Now, the moment you've been waiting for, I hope you'll join us for the reception in the atrium out there, and have a good evening. Stay cool.